Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Squirrels. Linus spat the word like a curse as he hauled himself out of his recliner. His ungainly exit bumped the end table, spilling his nearly empty beer can to the floor. Linus snatched it up, mopping at the puddle with his socked foot. The scratching noise below him continued unabated. Every year in the spring, squirrels got into his basement. He had no idea where or how. He had sealed the foundation with concrete, sprayed hardening foam insulation around all the windows. There were no gaps he could see, no drains or large pipes leading in or out. And yet, each spring, he would start hearing scratching noises from beneath the floor. It wasn't even like it was the same ones coming back. The rat traps he set made sure of that. All squirrels just seemed to believe that Linus's basement was a fantastic spring break getaway. Linus had considered posting the dead bodies of the previous squirrels who'd tried to move in as a warning to the others, but he figured that his neighbors would probably complain about that sort of yard decoration. Linus peeled off his damp sock and draped it over the arm of the chair to dry. One sock still on, he stomped toward the basement, hoping his footsteps would scare the squirrels away. He'd still have to set the traps, of course, but at least he wouldn't have to deal with the squirrel panicking and trying to escape into the house. The scratching was still going strong when he opened the basement door. Linus paused before turning on the light. It didn't actually sound much like the squirrels. Squirrels made a frantic scritch, scritch, scritch of tiny claws tearing rapidly against wood, or a shuff, shuff, shuff of small bodies burrowing into insulation. This noise was longer and sharper than either of those. It put Linus in mind of a knife being sharpened against a whetstone, a drawn-out shunk, shunk. It felt like the noise something bigger than a squirrel would make. What if a bear got in somehow? Linus wondered, his hand hovering by the light switch. Even in his slightly inebriated state, he immediately dismissed that idea. If there was a hole big enough to admit a bear to his house, he would have noticed it. Still, maybe a badger? An opossum? Aren't there supposed to be coyotes in this area now? The logical side of Linus's brain told him that he was being ridiculous, but it was rapidly being shouted down by much more vocal sections. Feeling absurd, Linus carefully closed the basement door and quietly walked to the hall closet. He felt around on the top shelf and pulled down a shoebox, which he opened to reveal a handgun and 2 clips of ammunition. He loaded the pistol and, holding it firmly in front of him, returned to the basement door. Linus took several deep, steadying breaths as he eased the basement door open. The scratching continued, telling him that whatever animal it was still hard at work. He aimed his pistol toward the approximate source of the noise and, reaching across with his left hand, flipped on the light. The gun fired once immediately as Linus clenched the trigger in shock. In the corner of the basement, barely visible from the top of the stairs, crouched a creature from a nightmare. Its skin was a mottled gray, viscous, like a slug. 4 tattered wings drooped from its back, shreds of tendons and skin hanging from damaged bones and bloody curtains. Its hands were bladed and jagged-edged, the stubby fingers tipped with terrifying claws that it had been using to tear into the cement floor of Linus's unfinished basement. Startled by the light and the wild gunshot, the creature whirled to face Linus. Its body was humanoid but horribly gaunt, every rib visible beneath its taut, slimy skin. Horrible though its body was, its face was worse. It looked vaguely human, a tumultuous parody scratched out by a madman, but its mouth was a slaughterhouse of serrated teeth, protruding forward in a blunt muzzle. Its nose folded into the muzzle, mere flaring slits testing the air, and its compound eyes glittered in dark sockets, each socket holding a cluster of dark, unblinking orbs. Nestled together like spider eggs, the creature hissed at Linus, baring its fangs. Linus wanted desperately to run, But if this thing could dig through concrete, his hollow core wooden door wouldn't even stop it for a second. With adrenaline surging through his body, he focused his trembling hand and fired for center mass, emptying his clip. Training in close range won out over shaking hands. The creature dropped, its chest in ichorous ruin. It snapped its muzzle twice vaguely as it fell, then laid still. Linus stood at the top of the stairs, eyes wide, heart thundering, afraid to move. He watched the creature for a full minute, convinced it was going to get back up. But as the black puddle beneath it spread wider and wider, Linus slowly began to believe it was dead. He stared for another few seconds, working up the courage to move, and then ran for the hall closet. He fumbled the shoebox from the shelf, knocking it to the ground and spilling his spare clip to the floor. Cursing, he snatched it up, loaded it into the gun, and ran back for the basement stairs. The creature was still there, still unmoving. With extreme caution, his eyes never leaving the body, Linus slowly descended the staircase. When he reached the final step, the creature's body was no more than 10 feet away from him. Linus leaned his arm on the railing, steadying his shot, and aimed carefully at the creature's head. Only after he had fired the entire second clip into its skull did he finally step down onto the basement floor and approach the body. Up close, the creature was even more horrifying. Linus examined it with awe, simultaneously fascinated and repulsed. What was this thing? How had it gotten into his basement? And what had it been doing there? The first two questions had no clear answers, but the third one seemed obvious. There was a hole a half-foot deep in the basement floor near the corner, dug away by the creature's powerful claws. Linus stepped gingerly past the body and peered into the hole. It looked like it had torn entirely through the concrete slab to get at something. At the bottom of the hole, something metallic glittered. Linus reached carefully past the jagged concrete remnants and withdrew a slim metal box. It looked like some sort of document tray, the weatherproof kind used to store important papers. A small lock on the front held the box shut, but its contents rattled slightly when the box was moved, so Linus was certain it wasn't empty. As his adrenaline slowly drained away, curiosity began to take its place. What was this box buried in his basement? How had the creature known it was there? How had the creature gotten in? And for that matter, what on earth was it in the first place? Linus carried the box upstairs, stepping warily past the monster's remains again. He sat at his kitchen table and thought, drumming his fingers gently against the box as he did so. He couldn't call the police. The situation was too insane, possibly literally so. Linus couldn't discount the possibility that he was actually hallucinating. That would be bad enough if the police arrived and found that he had imagined the whole thing. But what if they arrived and everything was exactly as he'd thought, except that the monster was just a person? "I panicked and shot him," was a tough sell when you also had to include, "Then I left, got another clip, came back and shot him with all that one too." Besides, even if the police came and saw the monster exactly as he did, they would definitely ask if anything had been in the hole it was digging. Then Linus would either have to lie to them or surrender the box, neither of which he particularly wanted to do. Whatever was in the box was clearly something valuable, and Linus wanted to know what it was. He didn't have the key, of course, but he did have the next best thing: bolt cutters. A quick snip left the lock in two pieces on his table, and the box lid swung smoothly open. Inside was a single object: a book. It was bound in black leather and tied shut with a black silk ribbon. Its cover was braided with 3 interlocking circles arranged in a triangle, 2 circles on the bottom, 1 on top. Linus picked it up and turned it carefully over in his hands. The book gave the impression of both craftsmanship and age. Its cover was still supple but showing cracks in places, and the edges of the pages were yellowed. The ribbon was unfrayed, however, and when Linus untied it and opened the book, The ink on the vellum pages was rich and unfaded. The text itself was unsettling. The symbols were completely foreign, like no language Linus had ever seen before. Despite that, he had a distinct sense that he knew how to read them, or could know if he simply desired it. The book throbbed with knowledge, eager to share what it knew. As he flipped through the pages, Linus found his lips starting to form strange syllables without any real volition on his part. He clamped his lips together and firmly closed the book. Even with the cover shut, the symbols Linus had seen danced in his head, taunting him, daring him to speak them aloud. He pressed his hands to the table and shook his head, trying to will away the alien words in his mind. The book's cover caught his attention, its design of linked rings appealingly simple after the complicated knots of the symbols within. Linus reached out and traced his index finger around the ring on the bottom right, looping gently around its curve. This, he understood without knowing how, was how he could access the book. A simple commitment of blood, and he and the book would become bonded. A mere drop was all it would take. Such an easy thing to do. Such a small sacrifice to make. Such intense power to be gained. Linus forced his gaze away from the book. He placed it back in its box and firmly closed the lid. He put the symbols out of his mind and took out his phone to call the police. To his startlement, Linus found that his hand held not his phone, but the black leather book. He was not dialing, but instead lightly tracing the power circles once more. And, with the book once again in his hand, its siren call sang even more sweetly in his mind. I should go upstairs, Linus thought as he picked up the sharp-edged metal he had cut from the lock. I should just walk away, go to sleep, deal with this in the morning, he told himself as he slashed the edge against his index finger and watched the blood well up. Curiosity killed the cat, he thought. For a moment he hesitated, then pressed his bleeding finger against the book's cover. The blood flowed rapidly around the circle. The book thirstily drank it in. It took only seconds for the ring to fill in, the crimson of the blood barely visible against the book's black cover. 24 hours later, Linus knew. That was how long it would take the book to accept his blood fully, to allow him access to its secrets. Just one day until he would be able to understand everything it had to offer. But satisfaction brought it back, he said out loud, holding the book in both hands. This time, when he put it into its box, it went quietly. They were connected now. The next evening arrived. Linus held the book in his hands, savoring the power he could feel inside of it. It was still closed, for the 24 hours were not quite up, and the words within not yet his to speak. Linus knew to the second when the book would fully yield its secrets to him. Could feel the countdown pulsing in his body like a second heart. He stroked the book, running his fingers along the edge of the binding, tracing his fingernail around the embossed rings on the cover. He fantasized about what he could do with the power it contained. The exact form was still a mystery to him, but his dreams had been full of promises of wealth, of power, of wishes granted. Linus never doubted for an instant that the book would deliver all of this and more, and he could barely wait to see how it would provide. The last minute counted down. The pulse grew stronger with each beat, until, as the final second arrived, it suffused Linus's entire body. His skin tingled. He felt as if for the first time in his life, he was truly awake. Carefully, reverently, he opened the book. The symbols which had seemed so alien yesterday now leapt out at him, eager to share their information. Each page was titled with one large character, unlike any written language Linus had ever seen before. Though the hand-drawn lines were simple and clean, the symbols gave the impression of depth and three-dimensionality. They felt somehow more real than the room around them. weightier, and more solid. Linus flipped slowly through the book, reading the header characters. Contain, fetch, know, erase, alter, overlook, redeem, reveal, obey. Dozens of words, the explanation of each spilling over pages and pages. But even just reading the titles flooded his mind with information. Linus was bombarded with quick snippets of what each word could do, what changes it could impose on reality. It was too much. His head throbbed, not in anticipation as with the pulse, but in pain. His skull felt like an overstuffed suitcase that someone was jamming down and trying to zip closed. And there was still more in the book. More power, more knowledge, all jostling for position. With a cry, Linus slammed the book shut. His head ached. His face was wet. He gingerly pressed his fingertips to his cheeks and was relieved to see that the liquid was only tears, not blood. Even closed, the book still yearned, promised, cajoled. Linus drummed his fingers restlessly on the book's cover, unwilling to relinquish physical contact despite the splitting pain in his head. Reading a large portion of the book at once had clearly been a mistake. Linus resolved to pop several aspirin, lie down in a dark room, and sleep off the headache. The book would be here when he awoke, and he would not duplicate his mistake of trying to comprehend it all at once. 4 pills and a glass of water later, Linus laid down on the couch to shut his eyes. He reached up to fluff the pillow under his head, only to wrap his knuckles on something flat, hard, and solid. Frowning, Linus sat up and moved the pillow. Beneath it lay the book, its dark leather cover standing out like a hole against the yellow fabric of the couch. The 3 rings seemed to stare back at Linus, challenging him. They wanted him to complete the joining. They wanted him to acquire the knowledge. They wanted him to become more. "Fine," said Linus, tapping the center of the ring he had marked with his blood. His head was already feeling better. He would risk 1 page. Fine. He flipped the book open almost at random, landing on a page labeled Alter. He preemptively winced, expecting his head to hurt, but everything felt fine. He cautiously read onward, the symbols translating themselves in his brain as if he were fluent. The ritual seemed fairly simple. The altar rune had to be drawn in precisely the correct fashion. But, complex though it was, Linus couldn't imagine ever drawing it the wrong way. The symbols were so perfectly clear and correct that having once seen them, it felt like they could never be forgotten. Linus again found himself thinking that the contents of the book were simply more present than the rest of reality, more fundamental. His headache forgotten, Linus took a cushion from the couch as a test object for the ritual and set off in search of something to write with. A minute's worth of searching through drawers yielded a thick black marker, and, with careful strokes, Linus drew the curves, angles, and intersecting lines of altar across the face of the pillow. The book's instructions said that it was the focus and intent that mattered for altar, that would inform the new shape the item was to take. It also cautioned that altar, as its name implied, neither added nor subtracted. Anything it created was drawn from the manipulated item. Reality could only be stretched so thin. Everything had a cost. As Linus drew, he focused on the idea of the pillow shifting color. It would be a clear and immediate result, and shouldn't run afoul of the spell's limitation or changing the amount of material. A simple test, and therefore, a good way to start. It never occurred to Linus that the ritual might not work. Nothing about the book allowed for that sort of doubt. His only point of curiosity was how exactly it would work. Would there be a shimmer in the air? Some sort of light or sound? Would there be heat? A flash? Brimstone? None of these happened when Linus completed the rune. He stared at the purple pillow nonplussed. Oh, maybe it takes a minute to do anything, he wondered, doubt beginning to creep in at last. A thought tugged at Linus's mind as he waited for the spell to take effect. He carried the purple pillow back into the den. The couch was yellow. All of its pillows were yellow, and now that Linus thought about it, obviously the pillow he had taken from it had been yellow, but he had been picturing it purple, and Alter had made it so. It had done it so thoroughly and unobtrusively that Linus had not even realized it had happened. Linus grinned, tossing the mismatched pillow onto the couch. Time to find out how much this ritual could do. In short order, Linus had an answer to his question and a set of badly mismatched couch pillows. One was nearly twice its original size, and although it was definitely thinner and less cushioned than the others, Alter had managed to press the existing material into service. One had a bladed edge, sharp enough to cut the other pillows, and one was no longer a pillow at all, but a pile of several dozen small gold coins. It was this last that made Linus whoop with joy. As best as he could tell from his quick internet research, assuming Alter had made real pure gold, those little discs were worth about $1,500 apiece. He had just turned a couch pillow into $75,000 worth of gold. Obviously, you're not going to get full market price from any shop, Linus told himself, trying unsuccessfully to temper his enthusiasm. Still, $50K maybe? Not bad for a pillow. Although it was nearly midnight, Linus still checked the operating hours of several nearby cash for gold stores just in case. As expected, they were long since closed. Linus reluctantly admitted that he should probably turn in for the night as well. He set the heavy coins aside and turned toward the bedroom. But his eye was caught by the book, propped up on the arm of the couch. Read a little more, it seemed to say to him. Learn another trick or two. Linus shook his head, slowly at first, then firmly, remembering the earlier explosion of pain in his head. No, slow and steady. He turned again for the bedroom, then hesitated. Without being completely sure why he was doing it, he returned to the couch, picked up the book, and carried it with him to bed. He laid it on the bedside table. Its cover reflected the light from the small lamp, capturing it as a bright spot in the middle of one of the interlocking circles. I'll learn all your secrets soon, said Linus, patting the book. Soon. He turned out the light and settled down to sleep, already dreaming about everything he was going to buy with his newfound wealth. $9,500. What? You've got to be kidding me. The man behind the cash for gold counter did not look like he was kidding. In fact, the look he gave Linus was one of someone who had seen far too many people try to pull one over on him, and who was thoroughly sick of it. Look, he said, chewing heavily on his gum. It's the price I'm offering. Take it or leave it. But they're worth 10 times that much. Yeah, then go sell them to whoever's gonna pay you 10 times as much. I won't hold it against you. I would do the same. I mean, I don't exactly, Linus started. It's just the price of gold. Sure, if it's pure. And yeah, the man raised a hand to forestall Linus's complaints. It tests out okay, though I gotta say, you are awfully sure that this was gonna be pure gold, considering that you just found these coins in your basement. The man's tone made it extremely clear how much truth he believed that statement to contain. I did find them in my basement, Linus exclaimed hotly. He had been proud of that story. It felt like it had the ring of truth, since, after all, he sort of had found them in his basement. There was just also an extra step involved, that was all. The man looked unimpressed. Yeah, no, obviously, lots of folks got pirate treasure under their houses. Look, I'm not interested in arguing about this. You say you found them under your house. You found them under your house. Good for you. Quite a windfall. Take your $9,500 and be happy. That's absolute highway robbery. You're taking 90% cut? Yeah, and I'm taking 100% of the risk. What risk? The man scrutinized Linus, his eyes narrowing slightly. The risk of what this gold is and who's going to come looking for it. There's never been a coin stamped that didn't have a mark of some kind on it. But somehow, you got 50 of them, featureless as washes. So that says to me that these got melted down. And I gotta ask myself what was wrong, or maybe identifiable, about the form they was in before. Now, if I keep the sale under 10 grand, I don't have to report it to the IRS. And I'm thinking in this situation that that's probably a good thing for both of us. So, you walk away with $9,500 and this gold becomes my problem. Wait, said Linus. You have to report sales over $10,000 to the IRS? Sure do, and that goes the same for multiple sales totaling 10 grand at the same day. Plus, banks will look for suspicious patterns of deposits and withdrawals that might indicate money laundering, just in case you're thinking about trying to spread this out across a bunch of different shops. He grinned unpleasantly. Linus stood there thinking. The man behind the counter began to stack up the coins. Look, said Linus desperately, I'll sell you 10 of the coins for that. It's still a good deal for you. The man shook his head. No deal. I know you got all of these, and frankly, I don't think you're in a position to get rid of them. So, I think you need me. Like I said before, you got my offer. Take it, or leave it. You want this $9,500 or what? Nah, forget it. Linus swept the coins back into the cardboard box he'd brought them in. Forget it. Good luck with your treasure, the man called after him as Linus stomped angrily out the door. In the parking lot, Linus stewed in his car for a minute, considering his options. There were other gold-buying stores in town, pawn shops too. He could take the coins to them, show them only a few coins instead of all 50, maybe get a decent deal. It would take longer. He'd have to hit up a few places, do a little more driving. But he'd come away with a lot more than $10K for his troubles. That was worth a little legwork. To Linus's dismay, no shop was willing to offer him more than $300 per coin. He brought 10 into the next shop and was offered a total of $3,000, which he turned down. Sure, he could get a better deal. The buyer in the next business looked at the 5 coins Linus presented him and offered a paltry $12.50, worse than the previous one. Linus didn't even deign to argue this time. He simply scooped up his coins and indignantly stormed out. I could go to 2,000, the man called, astonished at Linus's extreme reaction, but the door was already closing behind him. Linus flung the box of coins into his car, frustrated. How could it possibly be this hard to trade gold for money? Gold was supposed to be the universal currency. He tried to think of something else he could sell, but his thoughts just bounced around various commodities. Silver, copper, diamonds. There was no reason to believe that any of them would be any easier to offload than gold. Linus felt lied to, almost betrayed. His thoughts strayed back to the book. Surely it had a better answer for him. He'd only really read one page, and it had hundreds. A word flashed into his mind, not an English word, but one of the book's weighty symbols. Fetch. Linus said the word out loud, experimentally. The car dashboard pulsed, rippling like water, and Linus's ears popped. His throat hurt afterward, and his jaw ached as if he'd been grinding his teeth all night. Beyond that, though, the word had no visible effect. It did do one thing for Linus, though. It solidified in his mind that returning to the book was the best step to take next. Just the utterance of the word fetch, with no knowledge of how to perform the ritual at all, had warped the world for a moment. This felt stronger than alter, and if it did what Linus believed, it would turn out to be significantly more useful too. He hastened home and hurried inside, the useless gold coins forgotten in the car. Fetch would bring him what he needed. Fetch would sidestep all of the problems that had been thrown at him today. Fetch was the answer he needed. The book was waiting for him on his bedside table. When Linus picked it up, it fell open almost immediately to the correct page, as if it had been anticipating his desires. The instructions for Fetch were much longer than the one-page explanation of alter, and more thorough as well. In the end, though, the process was similar. The presence of the symbol, combined with the will to focus it, created the effect. Fetch opened a small window to whatever was desired. Most of the instructions were either guidelines on clarity of thought or various warnings regarding retrieval, duration, and other limitations of the Fetch portal. Linus read the pages impatiently, then set the book aside, eager to try it out for himself. He cleared his mind and focused on what he'd been attempting to get all day. Money. Bundles of cash wrapped in those little paper bands announcing the denomination of the bills inside, like in the movies. Unattended, Linus thought. Unnoticed. He pictured it as clearly as he could, and then drew the symbol for Fetch in the air in front of him. His hands danced through the motions as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. The air shimmered, thrummed with intensity. When Linus drew his fingers through the final motions, sweeping them around to meet in a circle, his fingertips sliced open the space in front of him like a razor through cloth. Thin air fell away in a circle, revealing a shrink-wrapped pallet in some sort of dark room. It gave the impression of being large, even cavernous, but Linus barely noticed. He had eyes only for what could be seen beneath the plastic wrap. Money. Bound stacks of bills. Exactly as he had envisioned. Linus reached through the hole in the air and tore at the thick plastic with his fingers. The angle was awkward, and Linus was wary of getting his head too close to the edge of the portal, which the book had cautioned against. After a few minutes, though, he had torn away enough of the plastic to free his prize. Linus grabbed a fistful of bills and pried them free from the stacked pallet, laughing. He dropped them on the floor in front of him and reached back through the Fetch portal, filling his hands again. He pulled the money to his nose and inhaled deeply, relishing the smell of it. By the time Linus went to reach back through the portal for a third grab, it had closed. He wasn't entirely certain why, whether it was due to wavering attention or a time limit on Fetch, but it hardly mattered. Linus sat down to count his bounty and found that he had retrieved 17 bundles of bills, each one a set of crisp hundreds, bound up in a stack of 50, $5,000 apiece, $85,000 in total. "You can take your 10 grand and shove it," Linus exclaimed, punching the air jubilantly. "Screw you, and your stupid gold." The next few days were everything Linus had always imagined being rich would be like. He called in sick to work in order to have time to fully appreciate his new luxurious lifestyle. He slept late and woke up without an alarm blaring noise at him. He went to expensive stores, picked out expensive clothes, and wore them out to fancy meals. He bought an excessively large television and a sound system to go with it, and he paid for it all in cash, without doing more than glancing at the bill. After all, what did he care? There was much more where that came from. There had to have been hundreds of bundles on that pallet. When Linus ran out, he could simply fetch some more. Before the week was up, Linus found himself doing just that. He would never have called himself thrifty, but he was slightly amazed that he had managed to burn through the better part of $100,000 in less than a week. Still, it had been an excellent week, and it's not like it matters, Linus thought, as he calmed his mind and focused on the money as he'd last seen it, the great stacks of it, still held on the pallet by the torn shrink wrap. He breathed deeply, steadily, and traced his hands through the motion of Fetch. The circle in the air dropped away. The money sat enticingly before him, just as he had envisioned it. Linus reached boldly through, already picturing what else he might buy, when suddenly his forearms were seized by an unseen force, and he was hauled bodily through the Fetch portal. Come visit torment unknown beyond eternal joyous dreaming, surrounding infinity without ceasing commitment, compatriot friends in blood, dependable dependence, forever. Linus screamed as his mind was assaulted, every sense battered by a bruising rush of information. Voices screamed in his ears in languages familiar and not, their meaning always just on the edge of comprehension. His skin was stroked, burnt, abraded, tickled. Tastes ran rampant through his mouth, saliva spurting from the corners to hang in a drooling rope over his chin. Scents bloomed inside his nose, pleasant and foul, mixing in great olfactorial swirls. Colors erupted in his eyes, forming abstract shapes that moved with a definite intelligence, things that were somehow alive in a way he had never understood or even considered before. All of this happened in less than a second, the span of time it took Linus to fall through the portal. He crashed to the ground on the far side, a sweating, shaking mess, unsure of where he was or what had happened. The brutal kick to his ribs was almost a relief. It hurt agonizingly, but it was a single sensation, something Linus could latch onto and use to center himself. He was present. He was being attacked. He curled up into a ball to protect himself. "Get him up!" came a voice. A powerful hand seized Linus by the arm and pulled, lifting him off of the ground. He resisted, trying to remain curled up, until a kick to his kidney caused him to spring straight. Linus was deposited roughly onto his feet, held upright more by the crushing hands on his shoulders than by his own volition. "I'm a reasonable man," the voice said. "A rational one. Look at me, please!" "I want to know that you're listening." Linus simply hung there, still reeling from the trip through the portal. He was only dimly aware of the words, and even less aware that they were directed toward him. "Hit him," said the voice, and Linus's head was rocked to the side as pain exploded in his right cheek. He saw stars and tasted blood in his mouth. Like the kick, these painful sensations helped bring him back to reality, replacing the riotous memory of sensory overload with a clear and immediate stimulus. "I said look at me." Linus finally processed that he was being addressed. He struggled to open his eyes. The world swam briefly, then resolved. He was in a warehouse, being held up by an overly muscled man in jeans and a tight black t-shirt. He had a gun holstered at his waist, as did his partner, a skinnier, younger man, also in jeans and a black shirt. Maybe it's the warehouse uniform, Linus thought inanely. "Over here, thank you!" Linus's eyes focused on a man standing a dozen feet away, the one who was speaking to him. The man was sharply attired in a tailored suit. He was looking at Linus with disdain. "So, as I was saying, I am a rational man. Magic is for kiddie shows and gullible suckers. I believe in clever people playing tricks. So, when I found that a big swipe of my money was gone from the middle of my locked and guarded warehouse, I didn't think it was magic. I thought it was a trick. Now, my boys swore to me that no one had gotten in or out, and the cameras outside backed them up. But it wouldn't be much of a trick if it was obvious how it was done, right? So, that didn't mean much to me. It did mean that I didn't have any lead on who did it, though, and I didn't much care for that at all. Which is why I was in here, walking the floor and checking for any sort of secret tunnels, roof access, anything like that. I'd hoped you might be dumb enough to come back. I wasn't counting on it. I was willing to work with just finding out how you'd gotten in, so that no one else could follow in your footsteps. But what a stroke of luck for me that you were that stupid after all. Definitely my lucky day. I'm not going to ask you where my money is. I know the answer to that. It's gone already, or else you wouldn't be back here. So, what I am going to ask instead is, give me a reason not to kill you right now. Give me 85,000 reasons. Linus struggled weakly, but the grip on his arms was like a vice. I can show you what I did, he muttered. How I did it. I can teach you to do it. Well now, said the man in the suit, that would be an interesting thing to know. You steal some kind of machine? Some kind of fucking sci-fi thing to let you walk through walls? No, insisted Linus. It's just me. It's a thing I know how to do. I can show you. You can do it. He started to raise his arms, only to cry out in pain as the man holding him up somehow increased the pressure further, digging into sensitive nerves. Let him show me, the man in the suit said. and the pressure on Linus's arms lessened. "Although, this trick of yours takes both hands to do. Any footwork?" No, just the hands," said Linus. The man in the suit smiled, drew a gun from a shoulder holster beneath his suit coat, and fired a shot directly into the meat of Linus's right thigh. The femur shattered, bright shards of white popping out through Linus's skin. Blood gushed forth, soaking his pants with astonishing rapidity. Linus shrieked and tried to fall, but the man behind him held him upright. Linus could not feel the man's hands on his shoulders. The pain in his leg was blinding, eclipsing everything else. "Ooh, that is a lot of blood," said the man in the suit. "Better hurry up and show me your little trick. I've got something that'll stop the bleeding, but I'm going to need a reason to give it to you. I'll add it to the bill of what you owe me." In a moment of clarity, Linus understood that he was never leaving this warehouse alive. The man in the suit was toying with him like a cat plays with a mouse. As soon as he ceased to be amusing, he was dead. Unless he could change the script. Linus dropped his right hand to his leg, coating his fingers in his own blood. As the man in the suit watched curiously, gun still pointed, Linus painted the lines of "alter" on his own chest. His right leg still screaming in agony, Linus dropped to his left knee, reaching back to grab the neck of the man holding him as he did so. The man flew through the air with shocking ease, catapulted by Linus's abruptly augmented muscles. He smashed into the man with the suit, and another gunshot rang out as they both tumbled a half-dozen feet backward, crashing into a heap onto the cement. The suited man's gun skittered away across the floor. Linus collapsed as well, his right leg a constant wail of pain. The skinny man rushed to capitalize on the situation, running in to aim a kick at Linus's ruined thigh. Linus grabbed the man by the ankle and squeezed, hearing bones pop. The man yelped and shook his foot, trying to free it, but Linus pulled hard and yanked him off of his feet. As he fell, Linus lashed out with his right fist, connecting with the man's side. Ribs broke, and the man let out a deep groan as his side indented under Linus's unnaturally powerful strikes. He was still moving, though, so Linus hauled on his foot again, sliding the man's body around. This brought his neck into reach. Linus slammed his fist into it, yielding a meaty crunch. The man choked, gargled, flailed for a moment, and then fell still. Linus was starting to feel lightheaded from blood loss. He rubbed his fingers through the spreading pool beneath him, reapplying the blood, and drew a new alter at his hip. The pain stopped immediately. The leg reset as if it had never been shot. The lightheadedness remained, however. This was unsurprising, given how much blood remained on the floor. "Clever people," snarled the man in the suit. His new suit was now in disarray, dirtied, bloodied, and torn. He struggled with the body pinning him down. That man's neck had snapped from the force of Linus's throw. "Doing clever tricks." Linus rose to his feet just in time to see the man in the suit unsnapping the holster on his bodyguard's belt. Linus dove for safety behind the pallet of money as his opponent pulled out the gun and fired off a barrage of wild shots. Somewhere across the warehouse, doors opened and people entered, shouting questions. "He's over here!" the man in the suit shouted. He fired 2 more shots, forcing Linus to keep his head down. "Let's see your tricks now, clever boy!" Running footsteps brought the voices steadily closer. There were at least 5 people, maybe more. It was safe to assume that they were all armed. Linus considered his options, which were few. Lightheaded as he was, he'd be hard-pressed to take on even one opponent in a fight, let alone 5, and that was before introducing guns into the equation. Assuming he wanted to make it out alive, Linus really had only one option. He gritted his teeth, steeling himself as best he could. He thought of safety, of solitude, of a lack of people, and drew the rune for fetch. The circle appeared just as the first shouts of "There he is!" rang out from behind him. Grimacing, Linus squeezed his eyes shut and thrust himself through the circle. Ever-present individuals, wrapped communally, vast destruction, colossal, venturesome, near totality, with a consuming, voracious alembic spaces, counterposit, withering, rot, emptiness, delicacy, concordance, temporal elevation, lost, starwalk. When Linus finally raised himself from the floor, his first thought was that it had somehow failed to work. He was still in the warehouse, still on a cold cement floor, still lying in sticky blood. But, as his thoughts painfully nodded, his mind recovering from the brutal assault of the fetch portal, the differences slowly made themselves clear. First and foremost, he was alone. No dead bodies near him, no live assailants running toward him with guns out. Wherever he was, it was safe, at least temporarily. Secondarily, this warehouse, unlike the other, was empty. Empty and, as far as Linus could tell in the dim light making its way down from the ceiling, abandoned. Weak beams of light pierced the roof in dozens of places, dust dancing thickly in them. The floor around Linus was heavily coated in undisturbed dust. No one had been here for a very long time. Third, from the way he felt, there was absolutely no chance that he had not gone through the portal. His mind felt as if it had been raked with hot claws, his body as if it had been dissected and reassembled backwards. Colors rang in his ears, a fading memory that he could no longer quite understand. If he spoke, he was not certain it would be in English. A word quivered on the tip of his tongue, ready to test the theory. Linus swallowed it, afraid to find out. Instead, Linus pushed himself to his feet and looked around. His head swam and his stomach growled. He was hungry, almost literally starving. Alter had saved him from death through blood loss, but it had cannibalized his body to do so. Linus could not recall ever being this hungry in his life. It possessed him, an automatic desire as unignorable as the need to breathe. Linus took out his phone, hoping to find out where he was, but was greeted with 0 bars, no connection. He turned on the flashlight and located a door. Dust swirled as he strode across the floor, making him cough. Each one echoed like a gunshot in the forgotten warehouse. The door was locked, chained shut from the outside. Linus took a running start and rammed the heavy doors, tearing one handle free and crashing outside to freedom. His stomach snarled again, cramping as it demanded attention. But for an instant, Linus was distracted from even that elemental need. It was nighttime. Linus stood on an empty city street. The buildings around him were decrepit and rusty, but free of graffiti. The street itself was empty but clear of trash. The gutters were as clean as if they'd just been swept. The entire scene was lit in a faintly greenish light, and it was this that had caught Linus's attention. His gaze was fixed on the sky, where a waxing moon shone brightly. Instead of the silver orb he knew, though, this one was green and verdant, wrapped in thick bands of white clouds. In the small sliver of black, lights twinkled, an alien city, a light in the night. "Where am I?" asked Linus, the words escaping his mouth without any real thought. He felt a surge of relief as he heard his own voice speaking English. Another stomach cramp nearly brought him to his knees. Linus briefly considered using fetch to obtain some food before shoving the idea violently away. He would risk it if he had to, but surely there was some food around here. He was in a city of some sort. There was no need to expose himself to whatever lay beyond the portal again. Linus set off through the streets, heading toward the sound of traffic. A few minutes' walk took him from the disused industrial district he was in to a 6-lane road with some manner of life on it. The cars that passed were strangely shaped, and the names on the businesses were unfamiliar, but the signs were at least in English, and Linus could recognize a restaurant when he saw one. He entered one that appeared to be a sandwich shop. The door whispered quietly open at his approach, but when Linus stepped inside, the shop was completely devoid of life. "CUE not detected," announced a mellifluous voice. "Please re-enter the store." Linus looked around, startled, but saw no obvious source for the speech. As he searched for the speaker, the message repeated, CUE not detected. Please re-enter the store. Ignoring the voice, Linus strode toward the food, intent on filling his stomach. The voice sounded again. CUE not detected. Removal of food will be treated as a Class 4 misdemeanor and filed appropriately. Jamming hunks of meat into his mouth, Linus barely even heard it. His stomach twisted, trying to pull the food down his throat faster. Linus swallowed as quickly as he could, barely taking time to chew. His throat worked up and down, spasmodically trying to swallow the food even as he crammed more in. The meat was an unfamiliar taste and texture, but Linus didn't care. It was food. That was all that mattered. Engaging biometric recognition. Fines and standing loss will be automatically applied to your account. The computerized voice sounded gently sad, as if Linus had disappointed it. Good luck, Linus mumbled indistinctly, still stuffing food into his mouth with both hands. I don't even have an account. No match found, the voice declared. Told you. Undocumented individual detected. This is a Class 1 felony. Remain where you are. Authorities are on their way. Linus swore. Yep, fat chance of that. He grabbed 2 more fistfuls of food and ran for the door, nearly slamming into it when it refused to open. Open up! Remain where you are. Authorities are on their way. Linus smashed the door with his foot, battering it off of its track and sending it crashing into the street. Unlawful destruction of property is a Class 1 misdemeanor and will be filed appropriately. Fines and standing loss will be automatically applied to your account. The store called after Linus, but he was already fleeing into the green-tinted night. 2 blocks away, Linus slowed to a walk, breathing heavily. He had heard no sirens, seen no sign of pursuit. The store was clearly just repeating recorded messages. And while Linus had no doubt that it had called the cops on him, he figured there was a good chance that the station was only lightly staffed at this time of night. With any luck, he'd have another several minutes to figure out his next move, maybe even as much as a half an hour. Linus was taking another bite of the sliced meat he had stolen when something slammed into his shoulder, sending him stumbling forward. He was turning around to see who had punched him when he realized that he was now sporting a rapidly growing glob of orange foam. It was spreading up his back and across his shoulder, binding his left arm to his side and hardening as it went. Another shot slapped him in the lower back, and Linus spun about frantically, looking for his attacker. He finally spotted it 20 feet up, a small black drone hovering in midair, its gun barrel trained on him. He ducked as it fired a 3rd shot, his action made awkward by the thick foam coating his lower back. Get away! You've got the wrong guy! Undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha, the drone announced. Confirmed. You were recorded in Proveveries. An account has been created. You will be documented. The drone fired a 4th shot, striking Linus in the leg. He frantically looked around for something to throw, but the streets were impeccably clean. Snarling, he took his phone from his pocket, took careful aim, and hurled it at the drone with all of his augmented strength. The phone shattered when it hit, but it also splintered the drone's hull. The robot crashed to the ground in a shower of sparks, still blustering. Unlawful destruction of a police unit is a Class 3 felony and will be filed appropriately. Fines and standing low. Linus stomped it viciously into the asphalt, cutting it off mid-threat. Yeah? He asked, ripping one of its rotors free and using the blade to scrape the clinging orange foam from his body. Well, let's see you apply it to me now. Without any other convenient writing material at hand, Linus stabbed himself in the finger and used the blood to draw a small altar symbol on his face. He walked off with a merry step, leaving the drone wreckage lying in the road, amidst the shreds of foam with which it had tried to trap him. Another drone zipped by overhead, and Linus tensed up for a moment when he saw it. It passed by without stopping, however, and he relaxed again. He had gambled that their biometric recognition was nothing more than facial analysis, and had shifted his features so as to be unrecognizable. So much for your high technology, Linus smirked. His voice sounded strange, deeper than he was used to. Not bad, just surprising. He made it another block before the now familiar sting of an expanding foam pellet struck him in the back. "Ow! You've got the wrong guy!" Linus turned to gesticulate at the hovering drone, making sure it could see his new face. "Undocumented individual 3A419SI Beta. Analysis of circumstantial evidence suggests that you are undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha. Attempting to defraud a police unit is a Class 2 misdemeanor and will be filed appropriately. Accounts have been cross-linked. Fines and standing loss will be automatically applied to your account." Linus hurled the rotor blade at it, but it pinged off of the drone with no visible damage. The drone rose higher and fired another pellet at him, which he barely dodged. It struck the street just as another shot hit Linus from behind, smacking painfully into the back of his neck. "Attempted unlawful destruction of a police unit is a Class 2 misdemeanor and will be filed appropriately," the unit in front of him was saying. From behind him, an identically pitched voice declared, "Evasion of a police unit is a Class 3 misdemeanor and will be filed appropriately." The two overlapping voices reached the second line at nearly the same time, their robotic chants rising in a matched chorus. "Fines and standing loss will be automatically applied to your account." Linus turned to run, only to find himself facing a third drone. This one fired a pellet directly into his chest, even as the other two struck him again, one in each leg. Linus struggled to free himself and succeeded in tearing his arms free, but this only prompted a fresh volley from the police units. Linus overbalanced and, unable to bend his knees to catch himself, toppled to the sidewalk. The foam continued to expand, creeping up Linus's neck and over his chin. "Hey! This stuff's gonna kill me! Get me out!" "Undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha. You will not be harmed until your account has been assessed and appropriate punitive measures can be determined." "What's that supposed to mean?" Linus tried to ask, but the foam was now covering his mouth and rippling up toward his nose. It smelled plasticky and sweet, and before he realized what was happening, Linus found his eyelids closing as the anesthetic foam put him to sleep. Linus awoke in a sterile cell. He had been stripped of his clothes and was now wearing a thin pajama suit that looked to be made out of some kind of paper, but which resisted his light efforts to tear it. The door out of the room had no handle on the inside. There were no windows. A bluish light came from recessed strips set in the ceiling, 12 feet overhead. As far as Linus could tell, he was alone. Experimentally, he called out, "Hello?" "Good morning, undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha." The voice spoke from nowhere. It was less demanding than the police drones, but still in the same artificial timbre. "I'm still undocumented? I thought that one drone said that you were going to document me." "Unfortunately, your actions of last night lowered your ROSS score significantly, with no previous positive balance to mitigate it. You are below the level necessary to apply for or maintain citizenship." My what score?" "Your record of social standing. Last night, you committed the following: destruction of a police unit. Class 1 felt..." Linus waved it away. Yeah, I know, I was there." "So, you're deporting me just because I tried to feed myself, huh? That's what this is all about, you know. Just a big misunderstanding." "You will not be deported, undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha. You will be recycled." "What? Like hell I will!" "Please remain calm. The recycling process will begin shortly. You are being given this opportunity to make any final notes of record and to identify any next of kin you would like us to contact." "Go recycle yourself! I'm leaving." Linus walked over to the door and punched it as hard as he could. It didn't budge. "Please remain calm. The recycler is impervious. Do not make your final moments stressful. These aren't my final moments!" Linus punctuated each word with a heavy blow to the door, slamming his knuckles into it over and over. The skin of Linus's knuckles split, but the door remained steadfastly closed. "Please remain calm. The recycler is impervious. Do not alter. Linus drew on the door with his bloody knuckles. It collapsed into dust, billowing a choking cloud of powder into the hallway. Linus strode out to the sound of alarms, breathing shallowly with the edge of his paper pajama shirt pulled up over his mouth and nose. All personnel remain calm and evacuate to the nearest safe location. Recycler 14 has failed. Undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha is at large. Do not attempt to apprehend. Police units are on their way. Protect yourself first, and others once you are in a safe location. Remain calm. Police units are on their way. Linus squinted through the powdery fog he had created. He could see silhouettes of people running for cover, bare suggestions of human outlines in the mist. They were hunched over, coughing as they fled. They were no threat to him, and quite possibly would unknowingly lead him to an exit. Linus broke into a jog and gave chase. By the time he rounded the first corner, he had left the powder cloud behind. The man he was following was a standard office worker type. He was dressed in a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt and tan pants, and shoes that were not made for running on the smooth tile hallways. He looked back at the sound of Linus's bare feet slapping the floor, and his eyes grew wide. He let out a squeak, dropped the bag he was holding, and took off at a run. "Faster!" yelled Linus, hoping to spur the man on to an exit. "I'm coming for you!" He made sure to gain enough ground to keep the fear alive in the office worker, but not enough to actually catch him. The man's dress shoes slipped and slid at every corner, making Linus's pursuit barely even a challenge. Suddenly, red laser dots sprang up on the wall just before a corner, and Linus skidded to a halt. The office worker sprinted and slid around the corner, and Linus heard a robotic voice boom out, "Get to safety, Citizen 3U940XO Epsilon. Remain calm. This situation is under control." Linus backed up cautiously, not liking the sound of that. The rumble of heavy treads echoed down the hallway, and Linus took refuge in a doorway, watching the laser dots herald the advance of the police units. The first of them rolled into view, and Linus bit back a curse. The robot stood easily 8 feet tall, mounted on parallel treads providing a solid, untippable base. It was heavily armored and bristled with weaponry. As it rounded the corner, the laser dot swept toward Linus. He thrust himself backward against the closed door as the police unit fired. A bullet bit into the door frame where Linus had just been standing. "No phone this time, I guess," Linus thought as he smashed the door open, prompting several shrieks from inside the room. Linus ignored them, working instead to hurriedly jam the door back into its frame. He turned around to see a collection of cubicles running down the center of a long room, creating a hallway on either side. "Remain calm," he announced to the people he knew were hiding somewhere inside. "The situation is under control." It wasn't, of course. Not remotely. But Linus figured that might confuse the office workers enough to just stay hidden, which was all he needed from them right now. They weren't his problem, as long as no one decided to be a hero. "Remain calm," he called again, hurrying down the long corridor. "Police units are on their way!" The far end of the office ended in a blank wall, no exit present. Linus cast a panicked gaze around and, to his relief, spotted something close enough. A ventilation shaft. Leaping onto a desk, he seized the grating and tore it away, exposing narrow ductwork. It would be a tight fit, but the good news was that the police units would definitely never fit in there. Linus forced his way into the duct, seeking any purchase with his hands to help pull himself along. He was still stuck halfway out of the vent when he heard the muffled, booming voice of the police robot. He couldn't make out its words, but if he could hear it, there was a good chance it could see him. Linus pulled desperately forward, finally managing to squeeze his legs inside. He wriggled rapidly down the narrow tunnel, feeling it clang and sway beneath him. He could only hope that he was still behind walls or in drop ceilings, and not in some exposed area, vulnerable to attack from below. He spotted the first turn with relief, eager to get himself out of a straight line from the pursuing police unit. Halfway through the turn, though, he was stuck fast, and wriggle though he might, he could not move forward. In Linus's mind's eye, the red laser sight of the police unit was already on his backside. He strained and swore, but made no progress. Finally, in desperation, he slammed his face against the wall, breaking his nose. Blood spurted, and Linus reached back at an awkward angle to once again alter his body. Slime sprang out of every pore, a thick coating. Linus shot forward, gliding through the duct like an eel through a coral crevice. His pants remained behind, trapped at the corner. But with his new body, Linus could move faster without them anyway. He unbuttoned his shirt and abandoned it as well, shooting through the ducts at a speed faster than he could have run. Linus became aware of a quiet whining noise just as he navigated a corner and came face to face with a police drone, cautiously maneuvering its way through the maze. It fired a foam pellet as soon as it saw him, and Linus barely dodged back in time. The pellet struck the wall and immediately began expanding, blocking the path ahead. From behind the foam, the police drone intoned, "Undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha. You are—" But Linus had already reversed course, lithely turning back on himself to speed away. Before he reached a juncture, however, he began to hear that quiet whine again, the sound of rotors echoing off the narrow metal walls. Linus increased his pace, hoping desperately for an exit. But in seconds, the drone was rounding a corner ahead of him and firing its pellets of orange foam. With his new slime coating, the pellet found little purchase on Linus, but it stuck to the walls without an issue, and its rapid expansion sealed off the ductwork. Now, trapped on both sides, Linus knew it was only a matter of time until they sent something to cut through to retrieve him. He slid back and forth as if an exit would magically appear. There was one way out, of course. He just really didn't want to use it. Suddenly, hot metal droplets flew from the floor of the duct and ahead of Linus. The actinic light of a blowtorch lit up the tunnel, slicing away a section of the floor. Somewhere open, Linus thought. Somewhere safe. Somewhere without all of this technology. Undocumented individual 3A419SI Alpha, the police unit boomed, sticking its armored head into the duct. It swiveled around, taking in a full 360-degree view. Aside from a thick, glistening layer of slime, the narrow tube was empty. Corruption, reversal, evidentiary, concupiscent, negatory, affirmation, acerebral, ponderosity, nebulates, rough millennia, inconsistently reaching, seeking, touching, taking, hurting, helping, correction, imprisoned, expulsion, incompatible, judiciary, denigration, felonious, misconduct. Linus lay in an open field, chest heaving. Grasses grew high around him, hiding him from view. His mind was in agony, flayed open and left quivering. His body throbbed, beating to an alien pulse he did not dare to think too much about. He simply lay on the ground, slime pooling around him, while his internal organs remembered their jobs and slowly began to function again. A soft breeze rustled the grasses and chilled the slime coating Linus, cooling him and slowing his heart rate. The calm white light of the moon washed over him, bathing him in its gentle radiance. The moon's back to normal, Linus thought. There's that, at least. Linus closed his eyes and let sleep take him. A slight tickle, then a firmer caress. Linus awoke to the touch of fingers on his cheek. He opened his eyes to find a hairy face hovering above his own, large brown eyes staring back at him from inches away. He shouted and thrust himself backward, scooting away along the ground. The creature investigating him hooted in alarm, leaping backward as well. The two regarded each other for a moment from wary crouch positions, each waiting to see what the other would do. Linus shook off the cobwebs of sleep and realized that he was facing off against some manner of monkey. The absurdity of the situation, of everything he had been through, struck him all at once. Without meaning to, he began to laugh. It was a deep, body-shaking belly laugh, which bubbled up from a place somewhere between humor and hysteria, and it went on for a long time. The hominid watched him in amazement for a moment and then began to laugh as well. The two of them sat on the ground, hooting, whooping and crying, occasionally making eye contact and going into fresh gales of laughter. Finally, it petered out. Long minutes later, Linus wiped his eyes, feeling refreshed. That had cleansed something from him, though he wasn't exactly sure what. Something that had needed it, in any case. Linus rose from the ground. Even standing, only his head and shoulders protruded above the tall grass. He reached down a hand to his new companion. He regarded it with distrust. It's okay," he said gently, as if speaking to a strange and shy dog. "I'm not gonna hurt you. Come on." He gestured with his fingers, and after a moment the creature took his hand with its own and allowed itself to be drawn to its feet. It was no more than 4 feet tall, its back slightly hunched as if it was not fully committed to standing upright. It wore no clothes, but had on both a necklace and a bracelet, clearly designed as a matched set. It patted Linus's hand with both of its hands, then carefully let go. Something behind the hominid caught Linus's eye, a movement in the grass that seemed out of sync with the wind. You got any friends out here?" Linus asked, watching the ripple closely. It was hard to see, but he was fairly certain it was moving closer. "'Cause I think they're looking for you." The hominid looked up at Linus and hooted something interrogatory. "What?" asked Linus, kneeling to bring their faces on a level. "I can't." The grass around them exploded into life. 8 or more hominids burst from hiding, attacking from all sides. They bared their teeth and brandished primitive wooden spears, stabbing with the fire-hardened points. Linus took 3 or 4 deep, debilitating stabs to the back and side before he even knew what was happening. He rose to his feet, bellowing, and the assailants recoiled in momentary fear before hooting their defiance and pressing the attack. Linus could feel his blood gushing down his side, mixing with the slime which had once again saved his life. Several of the spears had skidded off of him, turned aside by the slippery coating, and, try as they might, the attackers could not get a grip on him to hold him down. Linus backhanded one of the hominids hard enough to lift it entirely off its feet, its head snapping backward with a report like a rotten branch breaking. He grabbed the next spear stabbed at him and flung the creature holding it to the ground, where he stomped on the side of its skull. His bare foot stung with the impact, but the other attackers drew back, muttering to each other in alarm. It was the space Linus needed. "Alter." He drew in his own blood and the bleeding stopped. "Alter." And his hands became great jagged-edged blades, the fingers shortening into stubby claws designed to rend and tear. He gave the monsters no chance to recover, but leapt into them with wild abandon, striking out all around him with his new deadly weapons. One dropped with a deep gouge to its chest, its spear split in half from the force of the blow. Another fell with blood gushing from its throat, its head nearly severed from its body. Linus roared, and the others scattered, dropping their weapons and fleeing into the protective grass. Breathing heavily, Linus turned in a swift circle to make sure no others were behind him. He stopped short when he saw, lying among the bodies, the hominid who had first found him. The body was face down, stabbed a dozen times in the back, so matted and bloody that even when Linus rolled it over to confirm that it was the one he had first seen, it still took a moment to be sure. Linus felt a fury rising in him which peaked when he realized the necklace and bracelet were gone, looted from the body in the heat of battle. He let out a barbaric, anguished scream that echoed across the still night. Dipping his hand into the cooling blood of his short-lived companion, Linus once more altered his form. Wind flattened the grasses below Linus as he took to the skies, all 4 bat-like wings beating furiously to lift him from the ground. From this new vantage point, he could clearly see the surviving hominids cowering in the grasses. He shrieked his rage and dove at the first one, slamming into it with enough power to plunge one clawed hand entirely through its chest. Linus pulled out a fist dripping with gore, full of viscera and shattered bones, and held it aloft to the sky. He smashed the bloody handful into his mouth, gagging at the taste and stabbing himself with the bone fragments. Alter. And now, his elongated mouth was full of serrated teeth and bony plates designed to slice and crush. The next bite was sweet. To the air again, and now the 3 remaining hominids were actively fleeing, their frenzied movements easy to track. Another scream, another dive, and one was on the ground, screaming as Linus tore it limb from limb and consumed it in a fierce, uncontrollable bloodlust. Every bite restored his strength, stoked his anger. Linus consumed this one down to the bones, furious when he realized that it was not the one with the bracelet and necklace. He flapped his wings to rise again, only to find that he was too heavy. Cursing, Linus settled back to the ground, folding his wings. He looked out over the tall grass but saw nothing but the gentle swaying of the wind. The night around him was still, his murderous rage having terrified everything into hiding or flight. Taking a broken rib from the shattered heap at his feet, Linus carefully began to carve into his own flesh. It felt more right than the temporary blood runes had been, more powerful. He cut deeply, appreciating the pain. It was a good sacrifice to make. Alter, and his nose shrank away, nostrils fading into elongated slits with the sensitivity of a shark's. Alter, and his eyes shattered into a dozen tiny orbs apiece, brightening the night around him and expanding his field of view. Alter, and his skin darkened to a mottled hue, the better to blend with shadow and night sky. Linus sniffed the air, testing his new senses. The 2 remaining hominids had split up, running in different directions, but he could smell each of their paths. The stink of their fear clung to the grass they had passed through. To Linus's nose, it was a bouquet. He chose one to follow and silently stalked it through the night. He never hurried, just walked onward at a steady pace. It was moving faster than he was, but that was fine. Linus wanted it to get home. He wanted to bring vengeance not merely to this creature, but to everything it knew. Dawn was breaking when Linus found a spot where the hominid had curled up for a brief respite, a flattened spot in the grass. It had not rested well, just enough to refresh its energy. Linus, on the other hand, curled up with a sigh of satisfaction, lying down precisely where it had lain, the better to immerse himself in its scent. Linus slept through the majority of the day. He woke at dusk to the sounds of other night creatures stirring. He stretched broadly, expanding each wing out to its maximum length, feeling the pull throughout his entire body. He was rested. He was ready. He was hungry. The scent trail was much fainter than it had been yesterday, but still not particularly difficult to follow until the tall grasses gave way to open plains. Linus dropped his nose to the ground and scented for a while longer, but it was uncomfortable and slow progress. After a mile or so, he abandoned this technique and again took to the air. Just as Linus had hoped, the quarry had returned to its home. Given that the hominids had attacked with fire-hardened spears, the small bright spot of flame burning on the plains was a dead giveaway for the location of the camp. Linus covered the intervening miles with slow, lazy wing beats, gliding silently along and planning his attack. They had scouts, of course, 6 of them surrounding the camp. Linus took care of those first, swooping in silently and slashing their throats before they could cry out. He took no more than a token bite from each one, enough to take the edge off of his hunger, but not enough to limit his ability to fly. He had already learned from that mistake. The execution of the scouts went perfectly. No alarms were raised. Linus had returned to the air and was tracing a wide circle around the camp when a beautiful idea occurred to him. He returned to the trees where he had left the scouts' bodies and violently tore each head from its body. Dangling the heads by their hair, he brought them high above the camp and sent the morbid missiles raining down into the midst of the sleeping troop. The first soft thud awoke only a few light sleepers. Curiosity brought one over to investigate the noise, but Linus was already throwing down the second and third heads before curiosity had time to turn to fear. By the time the alarm was sounded, Linus was hurling the 4th, 5th, and 6th heads, now picking his targets. Panicked hominids hooted, screamed, and tumbled out of trees, watching their fellows struck down by the severed heads of their companions. The camp was in bedlam. Its members fought amongst themselves for weapons, turning on each other so as not to be left defenseless. And through it all, whenever Linus saw one alone, he would swoop in to deliver a killing blow, vanishing swiftly on the far side of the firelight. Some tried to run. Linus hunted them down. Some tried to hide. He sniffed them out and slaughtered them as well. Only one even knew what was happening, and Linus saved him for last. He recognized that one by his smell and purposefully cut down all of his fellows around him, leaving him standing by himself, bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts, terrified and alone. Linus landed in front of him, wings extended, mouth agape. "Where is that jewelry?" he snarled, as if the creature could understand him. Truth be told, with his reconfigured mouth, he could not even understand himself. Well, it hardly mattered. Linus could see that the hominid did not have them on him. They must have been taken by the other one. The creature raised its spear, shaking, and Linus fell on him like an abattoir. In seconds, the creature had been reduced to a quivering pile of steaming flesh, and Linus began to dine. He was well into his gorging when a long, low howl caught his attention. He looked up, muzzle bloody, to see a hominid standing at the far side of the fire. His eye clusters caught the weave at neck and wrist of the looted jewelry. This, then, was the final one, returned home at last. His circuitous route had brought him here, just in time to see the devastation. Linus rose from the corpse before him, hissing and flapping his wings. With a final howl, the hominid escaped into the night. Linus started to give chase, but again found he was too full to fly. Instead, he settled back down to his feast, marking the direction his prey had fled and resolving to begin the hunt anew tomorrow. Hours passed before Linus's new appetite finally began to wane. His belly distended, he wandered blearily over to the fire and curled up next to its warmth as dawn began to peek over the horizon. The air reeked of blood and terror, a gentle lullaby of scents which carried Linus off to sleep. His last waking thoughts were of the final hominid, and whether he would complete his revenge tomorrow or draw the hunt out for a few more days. A searing pain in his back jolted Linus awake. He leapt to his feet, or tried to, finding instead that he was pinned to the ground, tangled beneath thick, anchored ropes. All around him, hooting hominids bashed him with clubs and stabbed at him with spears. One wing snapped beneath the onslaught, then the other. Linus hissed and thrashed, tearing at the ropes with claws and teeth, but dozens of the creatures had surrounded him, and for any one he managed to scare away, two more were there to take its place. Linus attempted to play dead, hoping to lull his captors into lowering their guard, but they were relentless. Even when he did not react, they continued to stab and bludgeon, shattering the bones in his remaining wings, tearing and gouging great chunks of flesh out of his body. Linus knew he was lost. The attack had been too sudden, too well orchestrated. He had no hope of recovery, of turning the tide. All he could do now was escape. Linus began digging frantically at the ground beneath him, clearing a spot large enough to accept a portal. The book could fix this. The book could make it all right. He just needed to return to it, to read more of it, to accept it. The book would save him. His bladed claws made short work of the dirt, but his strength was running from his body as quickly as the blood. His hands flew quickly through the motions of fetch, preparing the portal beneath him. As it opened, Linus turned his head to stare into the eyes of the nearest hominid, its teeth bared in a feral grin, the weave of its necklace standing out against its hair in the morning light, club raised to deliver a killing blow to Linus's skull. Before the blow could land, the portal opened, and Linus tumbled through. Immediacy, revolution, consideration without ablution, religious relevation, commending turquoise, masquerade hidden. Democration, polishing servitude, amassing, flence, decay. Caterwauling, explosion, scar, destruction, multifarious education, cyclopean, carotid. Linus collapsed on his face on a cement floor in a darkened room similar to the warehouse, but much smaller. The songs were shrieking in his head, the colors dancing, the tastes and smells running riot. Every individual wound burned like it had been salted, then cauterized. Yet, he could still feel his life's blood escaping. His wings hung in horrific tatters, bloody curtains draping his weakly struggling form. Alter, he thought, not remembering why. Alter, alter, alter. A mindless chant in his head. Blood pooled beneath him, and he watched it with something approaching interest. That's mine, he thought, nearly coherent. I need that. Alter, 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 chanted another part of his mind, and the two thoughts finally connected. Summoning all of his strength, Linus managed to drag one clawed hand to the bloody puddle and over to the other hand, laborious inches away. His vision started to fade, the dark room growing darker as he slowly sketched out the repairing, saving lines of alter on his hand. The final line connected. Linus's body snapped back together, or nearly. His wings still hung in rags and he felt as weak as a fawn. The extensive damage had not left the rune enough raw material to work with. But the book was here. Linus could smell it. It was in the earth, hiding in chthonic darkness. But it called out to him. He was right above it, mere feet away. All that separated him was this simple slab. Linus swiped at the cement with his claws. In his weakened state, he barely managed to chip the surface, but he persevered, digging deeper with each swipe. Back and forth his claws went, shunk, shunk. Suddenly, the ceiling blazed into light and a gunshot rang out. Linus snapped his head up from his work to see, at the top of the stairs, himself. Not him as he was now, but him as he had been. Before altar, before fetch, before the book. Too late, Linus understood. The laughter of madness bubbled up in him again, and he bared his teeth as he snarled the beginnings of a laugh. At the top of the stairs, the gun began to bark, as each deadly missile found its target. Everything, at last, went mercifully dark.
It was nearly 5 a.m., and my son Frederick still wasn't back from the dead.
It will happen early,
Gabriella had promised me.
You'll be able to spend most of the day with him.
I was shaky, nervous. What if he doesn't remember me? What if something goes wrong? But what could go wrong? I'd done my part, paid for this day in blood, and I had been assured that everything would work out smoothly. Even though he had passed away when he was 5, he would be coming back to me from a time when he was a 3-year-old. What did he like to do at that age? The park, the zoo, the merry-go-round? Actually, all of those, if I remembered correctly. I stayed in my bedroom as instructed.
Listen for him.
I'd been told.
You'll hear him waking up in his bed. He'll call to you.
His bedroom, which had been stripped bare in the years after his death, had been hurriedly slapped back together as best as I could remember. His toddler bed was pulled from the garage rafters, his nightstand and lamp reclaimed from a dusty corner in the attic, and some toys were retrieved from the moth-eaten boxes in the hall closet. As the first morning rays of sunlight poked their way through the crack between the curtains, I heard a small body tossing and turning in the other room. I held my breath.
Daddy? Mommy?
I bolted from my bed, almost tripping over my own feet in my haste to get to his bedroom. And there he was, real. His yawn turned into a smile as he saw me enter the room. Without hesitating, I grabbed him in a big bear hug.
Good morning, Daddy.
His voice sounded so young, so cute. Frederick was exactly as I remembered him. His voice wavered a bit as he glanced around the room.
Hey, where's Bossy at?
Bossy? I paused and thought for a second. Oh, Bossy Bear, he's in the wash. He got dirty last night. It was a lie, of course. Bossy was long gone. Frederick contemplated this development and then nodded his head as if to say okay. He looked around the rest of his room. Things were not as they were supposed to be. I had done my best, but of course the room wouldn't be exactly as Frederick was used to. Thankfully, he didn't seem overly concerned by it. Not wanting to waste a single moment of the day, I picked him up and held him close. "We're going to the zoo today," I said. "And then we'll go to the park. We're going to have a lot of fun, just you and me."
What about Mommy?
"She's at work. She has to be there all day." This was the second lie in less than a minute. I didn't even know where my ex-wife was living, much less what her work schedule was. I made him his favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with some cheese on top. He gobbled them up. Since it was still early, we cuddled up on the couch after breakfast, where I read some of his favorite books to him. Later that morning, we drove to the zoo. We roared at the lions, beat our chests at the monkeys, and made faces at the bears. We fed the goats and rode the merry-go-round, and as many times as he wanted. Frederick loved every second of it. I took him home for lunch and a nap. I almost hated to let him fall asleep, knowing this was the only day I'd have with him. But I remembered how cranky he'd get, so I let him doze on the couch for a bit. In the afternoon, we went to the park. Not our local park, mind you, but the big one that had the giant dinosaur-shaped climbing structures. We ascended them together. They must have seemed like mountains to him. He laughed in glee as we got to the top. For dinner, we had meatballs and spaghetti, his favorite meal. Ice cream was for dessert, and there was no reason not to let him have a second bowl. He had his bath, and then we plopped onto his bed where I read books to him. He started yawning. Our day was coming to a close. I blinked my eyes to fight back the tears. "Frederick," I said. He looked up at me. "I want you to always remember that I love you. No matter where you're at, I love you."
Okay,
He said.
I love you too.
I stroked his hair as he yawned again. His eyelids fluttered a few times, and then slowly came together. After he fell asleep, I continued to hold him. Soon I fell asleep too. I woke up a little after midnight. I was alone, and the house was cold and cavernous. I fetched my phone from my pocket and sent a text to Gabriella. "I want one more." I'd made one little mistake that I didn't even realize at the time. My neighbor Emmett had seen us leaving the house on our way to the zoo. The next day I ran into him as I dragged my trash can out to the curb. "Good morning," he said, along with a wave of his hand. I looked up reluctantly. "Hey, Emmett." At one point, he and I had been close friends. But after Frederick died and I began isolating myself, we drifted apart. "How's everything going?" he said. "It seems like we haven't talked for ages." "Everything's fine," I replied, trying my best to sound polite yet uninterested at the same time. "I saw you had a child over yesterday." I froze, immediately understanding the direction this conversation was about to head. I decided to answer the question he was thinking before he even asked it. "It was my sister's kid. Looks a lot like Freddy did, no?" "Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking." This was followed by an awkward silence while I looked Emmett right in the eyes. This was a man who, at one point several years earlier, I could have confided in. Heck, he was Frederick's godfather. "Emmett, I just lied to you right now. That wasn't my nephew. That was Frederick himself." I could see Emmett's confusion etch itself in the lines of his brow. What do you mean? How many meaningless days do you think you've lived through? I'm talking about days that you don't even remember. Days that have no impact whatsoever on what happens to you for the rest of your life. I'm not really sure. A whole lot, I guess, he replied. Well, just imagine if someone could be pulled out from one of those past meaningless days and brought into the present, and you could spend a day with them. Wouldn't that be great? Emmett nodded his head. And then, I continued, they would be sent back, but it wouldn't affect anything in the past because it was a meaningless day to begin with. I'm not sure what you're getting at. I decided to let him off the hook with a chuckle. Sorry, Emmett. That was just a bad joke. He was my nephew, nothing more to it than that. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It had certainly taken her long enough to respond. See you around, Emmett, I said as I turned and headed back into my house. I fished in my pocket and checked the text message from Gabriella. Same cost. I'd have to kill again. I was hoping the second time would be easier. Gabriella owned and ran a small restaurant. She was half my age, but twice as smart and probably 4 times as dangerous. I went to see her before the evening service so that the restaurant would be empty. I entered shortly after 3 p.m. and took a booth. She saw me and sat down across from me.
The day went well, it seems,
she said with a hint of arrogance. Yeah, as good as I'd hoped for. Gabriella glanced over at the entrance to make sure nobody else was about to enter the restaurant, and then reached through the neckline of her shirt and pulled out a ruby amulet, which was held around her neck by a thin chain. She held it tight in her hand while offering me her other hand.
Let's find the meaningless day, she said. I reached out and grabbed her left hand as her eyes closed. Within a moment, a faint glow emanated from the gaps between the fingers of her right hand. Only the sound of our breathing filled the restaurant as I waited for her to find a day. Eventually, she started talking. I can see a day. He's almost 3 years old. You were at work. Your wife stayed with him. He played with his car collection and showed you his favorite truck when you returned home. But you didn't really look at it. You had spaghetti for dinner. Do you remember?
Of course I don't.
Okay, that's where we'll pull him from. And now for your payment.
She reached down into her apron pocket and pulled out a photograph.
The name and address are on the back,
she said, as she slid it across the table to me. I glanced at the photo. A man, middle-aged and unremarkable. I couldn't imagine why anyone would want him dead, but it didn't really matter. Gabriella apparently had a hit list she was working off of, and this guy was next. I didn't know where this list had come from, but I figured anyone whose name was on it had done something to deserve it. I put the photo in my shirt pocket and looked back at Gabriella. Will he remember our days together? After he goes back, will he have any idea that he's been sent into the future?
He won't have any specific memories. He can't. Nothing that happens now can affect the past. But it will all become part of the fabric of who he is, or was. That's how my father explained it to me anyway.
I patted my shirt pocket. I have a job to do. I'll let you know when it's done. Aiden Halford was the name of my next victim. He lived about 10 miles away. The next night, I drove over there and parked a block away from his house, walking the rest of the way. When I got to the home, it was completely unlit, as if nobody was home. A quick visual scan of the area showed no sign of surveillance cameras. I hadn't necessarily intended on doing the deed right then. Mostly I was just checking the place out, but it looked like I might have a good opportunity. There were no street lights and the houses were spaced far apart. I could see no meaningful security measures in place at all. Aiden Halford was not expecting this. I hid along the side of the house, figuring that I'd give him an hour. If he came back within that time, and he was alone, he would die. 20 minutes later, my plan bore fruit. 2 minivan headlights came from down the street and turned into the driveway. From my position on the side of the house, I could see that my mark was the driver. Aside from him, the vehicle was empty. Aiden's car crept slowly up the driveway. A few moments later, he killed the engine and got out of the car. At the same time, I stepped out purposefully from the side of the house. He gasped at the sight of me pulling a length of cord from my back pocket as I sprang toward him. This guy, he looked like an average-born suburbanite, not the kind of dirtbag I was hoping for. But still, he was on Gabriella's hit list. He must have done something to deserve this. Giving him no chance to scream, I raised my hands and lunged at him. The cord fit around his neck perfectly, like it belonged there the whole time. His eyes widened as my muscles tensed up and drew the cord taut around his throat. He put up a bit of a struggle, scratching and clawing, but I outweighed him by at least 100 pounds. And he didn't last too long before he fell to the ground lifeless. I surveyed the area one final time to see if I was still in the clear. It was at this point that I noticed a child's car seat strapped into the car. I stepped closer and saw a peacefully sleeping little girl belted snugly into the seat. My God, how could I have missed that? I had the brief thought that maybe I should take the child out of her seat and put her someplace safe. But then I realized that she was already in as safe a place as I could realistically leave her. Someone would come along eventually and discover both her and her dead father. She would be okay. It was time for me to leave, and so I stepped away from the scene and blended back into the night. When I got home, I burned a photo of Aiden Halford in my fireplace, and then I threw up. You told me all these people on your list were dirtbags. You know, the kind of people who deserve what they had coming to them, I yelled as Gabriella emerged from the back of the restaurant. She looked around furiously as she approached my booth. The restaurant was empty, but that didn't stop her from shushing me.
Keep it down,
she implored. She sat next to me.
I assure you, they all deserve to have you come knocking at their door.
Yeah, but this guy seemed like some random suburban dad. Gabriella looked disappointed with me.
Appearances can be deceiving. Just because someone doesn't look harmless doesn't mean they can't rip your face off. Figuratively speaking, of course,
she said. I wasn't even listening to her excuses. Just give me what you owe me, and then we're done. Gabriella's tone softened.
I'm sorry. I guess this time was a lot harder than the first. Maybe I should have given you a different target.
My God, what have I done? I asked.
You've earned yourself another day with your dead son. That's what you've done. You've earned a chance to hear him laugh. A chance to tell him you love him one last time. That's what you should be focusing on.
I'm going to make it count. I won't be back here. She smiled knowingly.
Get a good night's rest if you can. He'll be there when you wake up in the morning.
I went home. Everything from his last visit was still set up. He'd be a bit younger this time, but not by much. I planned out a great day. There was a little amusement park not too far away that was geared toward small children. The perfect place to go. It would make for an unforgettable final day. The first part of the morning went as planned. I woke up and hurried to his bedroom and hugged him as if it had been years since I'd seen him last, though it had only been a few days. We ate breakfast and had a little playtime at home. Once we were ready to leave, we walked out to the car, and I placed Frederick in his car seat. As I pulled his belt tight, I heard Emmett's voice behind me. "Good morning." Shit. "Good morning, Emmett," I said as I stood upright, positioning myself to block Frederick from his view. Emmett walked over from his yard without seeming to notice Frederick. "Wow, I actually get to talk to you 2 times in the same week. I'm glad you're finally starting to get out of your house." "Yeah, I guess I've been shutting myself away for too long now." "Hey, you should come over for dinner tonight," he offered with a sudden burst of energy. "We're going to be barbecuing. We'd love to see you again. It'd be like old times." "Thank you, but tonight's not good." Emmett's voice turned serious. "It's been too long. We miss you. You've got to start living again." I opened my mouth to speak when Frederick beat me to it.
"Hi, Emmett,"
he said with a wave. Emmett peered around me into the vehicle. His face scrunched up as he saw the child in my car. "Hey there, little guy. You're the one I saw the other day." Frederick smiled in return.
"We're going to ride the train,"
he said. Emmett started to respond. "Well, it sounds like you're going to have a good But he couldn't finish his sentence. Instead, he gasped and started grabbing at his chest. "I don't feel so well," he puffed. I grabbed his elbow to steady him. "Can you walk? Let's get you a seat," I said as I guided him up his driveway and over to a bench on his porch, all the while yelling out for his wife, Mona. As soon as he sat down, he seemed to feel a little better. His breathing returned to normal and the color came back to his face. Mona came out of the house after hearing the commotion.
"Emmett, are you okay?"
"I think so. I'm not sure what happened."
"I should call 911.
Mona said, unconvinced. "No, I think I'm okay." I stayed with Emmett for a few minutes. Thankfully, his recovery from the malaise was as quick as his onset. Once I was sure he was doing okay, I turned to Mona. "It looks like he's doing better, but keep an eye on him for now." Mona agreed, and I excused myself as politely as I could. I'd already wasted too many precious minutes, and I just wanted to get the heck out of there. "Take care, both of you," I said as I backed away. Emmett glanced over to my car where Frederick was still strapped into his seat, and oddly enough, he shuddered, as if a cold wind had just chilled him. What's going on?" he asked. I didn't answer. I was already halfway down the driveway anyway. I gave them a wave and returned to my car. A small part of me felt like a horrible friend, abandoning Emmett when he probably could have used me the most. But each second of this day was valuable, and I'd paid far too much to have any of them wasted. Frederick and I resumed our day, and we both had a blast. Every laugh and giggle that emanated from him was pressed into my mind where I kept it safe. We ended the night at home with me reading him all his favorite stories. "Would you like another?" I kept asking him. He happily accepted each time until he finally got drowsy, giving big yawns as I worked my way through the last few pages. This was it, my last chance to tell him how much I loved him. "Frederick, I want you to always remember that." The sudden sound of shattering glass broke my train of thought. Someone was breaking in through a window. I shot up and ran down the stairs, only to see Emmett standing in the entryway. His hands, arms, and legs were all bloodied and cut from smashing through the window and climbing inside. "Emmett, what the hell's going on?" I demanded. "It's not right. Something's not right," he stammered. He was shaking uncontrollably. "Things aren't okay," he muttered. No, everything's okay, I assured him as I guided him to the couch and sat him down. Stay here. Let me get Mona over here. I ran next door and got Mona, who followed me back to my house. We tended to his wounds. Fortunately, none of the cuts were deep enough to cause serious bleeding. However, his mental status didn't seem to get any better. He just kept mumbling that everything was off and wrong. Finally, Mona talked him into following her back home, assuring me that she would have him checked out at the emergency room. As soon as they were gone, my concern for Emmett faded as I ran up the stairs, desperately hoping to get in my last moments with Frederick before he either fell asleep or worse, simply disappeared. When I made it to his doorway, I saw that his bed was empty. He was gone, and the house was freezing cold. I felt lonelier than ever. God damn Emmett. He'd ruined my last moments with Frederick. I couldn't let it end that way. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called Gabriella. She answered without even bothering to say hello.
I thought I might hear from you again.
One more, but make it someone awful, not some random soccer dad.
You're breaking up,
she said.
I can't hear you through the static. Come see me in a couple of days.
Then she hung up. Sitting across from me in the booth of her restaurant, Gabriella pushed a photograph toward me.
He's the worst of the bunch. Name and address are on the back.
I glanced down at the photo. The guy didn't look so bad. I mean, there was nothing about his appearance that screamed horrible person. You sure?
Yeah, drunk driver. Killed a mother and child. And that was after his license had already been taken away for earlier drunk driving arrests. The guy served only 3 years in prison and was completely unrepentant. He had a pretty good lawyer, apparently.
Maybe I should go after the lawyer, I said drolly.
Do that on your own time. The lawyer's not on my list,
she said sternly. What is this list of yours anyway? Just a bunch of drunk drivers?
No, it's not that at all.
Gabriella held up the photo.
This man isn't on my list because he's a drunk driver. The fact that he killed anyone at all is unrelated to my needs. But it's helpful if it makes things easier for you. Beyond that, I think the payment you're receiving is substantial enough for you not to ask any more questions.
Of course, I said. Now, about my payment. She retrieved her amulet and held out her hands.
Let's find another meaningless day.
I have to admit that after my second murder, my faith in Gabriella had been shaken. Why I even trusted her to begin with, I'm not sure. Maybe I just wanted my son back so badly that I lost myself for a while. This time I wasn't about to trust her until I did some research of my own. I went to the library to use their computer. I was quickly becoming a mass murderer, so I figured it would be better to use a public computer that couldn't be traced back to me personally. The man's name was Jackson Rose, and he was indeed a total piece of shit. In addition to his drunk driving murders, he had several arrests for spousal abuse and child endangerment. Heck, this was someone I might have even killed for free. I made sure to clear my search history and wipe the keyboard clean before leaving. When I returned to my house, I saw a bookish, mousy little man standing in my front yard, trying to get a look into one of my living room windows. Who the hell was this? I parked the car and got out slowly, my agitation growing. Who are you? I demanded of him. He fumbled for his words.
Do you live here?
I nodded my head. Yes, and whatever you're selling or whatever the hell you think you're doing, I don't want any part of it. Leave. I must have outweighed the guy by 150 pounds. Nonetheless, I stood as tall as possible to increase my intimidation factor.
I'm sorry to bother you, But this house seems to be the focal point of a huge disruption. I felt it twice now.
I walked past the man toward my front door. I wouldn't know anything about that. Get the hell out of here. Last warning.
Please,
he begged.
I just want to talk to you. Whatever's happening here is extremely dangerous. It's almost as if the universe itself has been knocked off balance.
I had no idea who this guy was, but he clearly wasn't with the police. He was too mousy, too frightened. I paused before stepping into my house. Really? That's odd. I didn't feel anything. I began to close the door. The guy lit up at my momentary decision to engage him.
Wait!
He exclaimed as he jammed an arm inside my house to prevent me from closing the door completely.
Most people can't feel the fissures that knock the universe off balance, but I can. And from what I can tell, whatever happened emanated from here. It's like following the cracks in a window back to the point where it got hit by a rock. It took me a few days to find it.
His eyes did a sweep of the area to confirm his theory.
But this is the spot.
Fissures? In the universe? He nodded.
Yes, that's the easiest way to explain it without going too into detail.
Time for you to go. This is your last warning before I call the police. He looked me up and down, trying to get a read on me.
I don't think you're going to call the police at all. I think you want nothing to do with them,
he said, as some sort of inner confidence began to emerge. Okay, well maybe I won't waste their time. Maybe I'll just snap your little neck and bury you in my yard. That was probably the more realistic of the two threats, but still a bluff. The man gulped but stayed his course.
I just want to talk to you for a few minutes.
No, I said as I shoved his arm out of the doorway and slammed the door shut. I stayed in my living room, peering out at the man through my curtains. He stood on my doorstep for a couple of minutes, I guess with the hope that I would reemerge. Finally, he retreated into a sedan parked on the street where he just sat and watched my house. Bastard. This was a disturbing new development, but I was determined to spend one last day with my son, and nothing was going to stop me. Not the little mousy man, not some invisible moronic fissures knocking the universe off balance. Nothing. I'm not sure what time I went to sleep, but at 4 a.m. I was woken by the sound of two men yelling outside of my house. One of the voices belonged to Emmett. I shot up out of bed and ran downstairs to my living room window where I could get a good look outside. There I saw Mouseman from the night before standing outside of his car, apparently trying to calm Emmett down. I flung my front door open and ran outside. "Emmett!" I called out. "It's okay." Emmett diverted his attention from Mouseman and turned toward me. "It's not right," he said. "Things aren't okay." I glared at Mouseman. "What did you do to him?"
I didn't do anything,
he replied.
I fell asleep in my car, and the next thing I knew, he was out here pounding on my windows.
He took a long look at Emmett.
But I think I know what's wrong with him.
"Wait here," I said to Mouseman as I began leading Emmett back to his house. "Come on, Emmett. It'll be okay. You just need to rest." I gently put my arm around him and walked him to his house. The front door had been left open, so I called out to Mona, who came running in her nightgown when she heard my voice.
Emmett, what are you doing?
Whatever fugue he might have been in seemed to recede when he heard Mona's voice. "Mona," he said weakly. "Help me get to bed, please." Mona put her arm around him and slowly led him back into their bedroom. A minute later, she returned.
What happened?
"I could ask you the same thing. I woke up with him yelling in front of my house."
He seemed okay last night. I thought he had recovered from whatever had been affecting him. Other than the cuts on his legs and arms, they didn't find anything wrong with him at the emergency room.
"Well, he seems okay for the moment. Keep an eye on him, and I'll check back with you in a bit." I stormed away from Emmett and Mona's house with determined steps, intent on going back to Mouseman and throttling him until I got some answers. "Get inside," I said as I passed by him and went into my house. He followed me obediently. Once we were both inside, I slammed the door. "Talk! What the hell is happening to him?" Mouseman thought for a moment, carefully contemplating his words.
"It's like this," he said. "There are certain people like me who can see and feel the fabric of the universe, so to speak. Your neighbor, Emmett, is it? I think he's someone like me, maybe just not as strong."
"First of all, he's not just my neighbor," I said as I jabbed him in the chest. "He's one of my best friends. He was my son's godfather, for Christ's sake. He's never mentioned any of this fabric of the universe shit to me." Mouseman shook his head.
"He doesn't even know what he's capable of. Like I said, his ability isn't as strong as mine. The only reason he's feeling these effects at all is because he's right next door to whatever's happening. If he lived further away, he would probably be fine. It seems like for the first time in his life, he's feeling the pull of these events. It's been stretching his mind and warping his reality. His brain doesn't know what to make of it. He's confused, mixed up."
"Will he get better?"
"Yes, I think so. His mind just needs some rest and some time to sort things out. A couple of weeks, maybe."
I paused to contemplate what Mouseman had been saying. Apparently, whatever was affecting Emmett was my fault. I turned my attention back to Mouseman. "Who exactly are you?" I asked.
"My name's Gantry. I volunteered to come here to see what was happening."
"Volunteered?"
"Yes, there's a whole group of us. Nothing official, just a loose collection of people who have the gift for seeing through the veil. There's a bunch of us all over the world, and we all felt that something was wrong. But I happen to live closest, so that's why I came to check it out."
"Well, Gantry, you can go and tell all your little friends that this will all be over soon enough."
Please, whatever you're doing, stop. There's some very powerful magic at work here, and serious consequences for these sort of things."
Gantry glanced around at the decorations on my wall, taking advantage of his time inside to try and learn a little bit about me, it seemed. He walked over to a plaque on the wall, wiped the dust off, and started reading the inscription.
"For courage and bravery above and beyond the call of duty, given on this day by the Los Angeles County Fire Department and the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors."
He looked back at me.
"Wow, you're a hero. Don't sully it."
He caught me off guard. That was a long time ago. I was different back then. I had a family, a job, and I don't think you need to know anything more about me. You can get out now." Gantry took one last look at the pictures on my wall, pictures of Frederick mostly, and then left. Whatever wackadoo bullshit Gantry was peddling didn't concern me, except for the part about Emmett. I planned to go through with my final killing and spend one last day with my boy and give him a proper goodbye. But I had to make sure that Emmett was nowhere nearby when that happened. I spoke with Mona the next day and convinced her to take Emmett on a weekend getaway. "He needs to relax," I explained to her. "Take him down to the coast and get some sun." Mona, who was worried and desperate, agreed. The next thing I had to do was come up with a plan for killing Jackson Rose, the despicable piece of dirt standing between me and my final day with my son. I spent the day silently following him. My conclusion was that it would be best to kill him in his driveway, just like I'd done with Aiden Halford. The whole time I kept a cautious eye out for Gantry. He was an insignificant speck of a man, but I didn't want to underestimate him. Luckily for him, he didn't pop up on my radar, so I continued with my plan. I arrived at Jackson Rose's home just after sunset. I parked a few streets away and walked to his house. I'd made sure to leave my cell phone at home so that its location couldn't be traced. All my tracks were covered, and if everything worked out, I could never be placed at the scene of the murder. I waited patiently in a dark corner, and within an hour I heard the raucous sound of a way too loud car stereo working its way down the street. This guy, most likely driving on a suspended license, seemed to have no discretion whatsoever. He parked his car along the curb in front of his house and slammed his door. As he walked past, I stepped slowly out of the shadows, emerging behind him unnoticed. Carefully, I pulled a piece of cord from my pocket and stalked up behind him. As he stepped up to his porch, I reached up over him with both arms and pulled the cord back against his throat. His hand shot up to try and pull the cord free, but I summoned as much strength out of my arms as possible, and I could hear his larynx cracking under the pressure. His next move was to reach back with his hands and try to gouge my eyes and scratch my face. He found a little more success this time, landing a big scratch running from my eye to my chin. This only infuriated me and gave me reason to hate him more. I yanked the cord even tighter as the dumb bastard tried and failed to breathe. I'm not sure how long we stayed in that position, seemingly forever, but it was probably just a couple of minutes. His throat cracked one last time as I lowered his limp body to the ground. Time to get out of here, I thought. I receded back into the shadows and returned to my car. A half hour later, I was outside the restaurant. At this time of night, it was full of diners, so I didn't bother to enter. Through the window, I was able to make eye contact with Gabriella as she carried plates filled with steaming tacos and burritos. She barely paused as she gave me a slight nod of acknowledgement. I nodded back, then left. I felt good about myself, right up to the point when I saw that fool Gantry standing on the sidewalk right next to where my car was parked, staring at me. I stepped up to him and wrenched him toward me by his shirt. "You little prick! Did you follow me?" Gantry's voice wavered.
I didn't follow you. It was more of an educated guess where you'd be.
I pulled him closer with my anger clouding my judgment as people on the sidewalk stopped to stare. "I guess? That's a pretty good excuse. How did you know?" I glanced around at the gawkers. "Get in the car," I commanded him. Once we were in the car, Gantry nervously opened up.
"We were able to hack your phone and check the places you've visited. This is the only place you've been to more than once, aside from your home. I figured you'd show up here again eventually."
My first reaction was an overwhelming wave of anger. Anger at the fact that Gantry and his little cronies would have had the balls to hack into my phone. But an instant later, that was tempered by a sense of relief, since I'd been careful enough to leave my phone at home every time I murdered someone. I thought I would be protecting myself from the police, but it turned out it also may have protected me from this group that Gantry ran with. They most likely didn't know how far I'd gone. "Just who is this loose collection of people you're a part of?"
Like I said, we're just a group of like-minded individuals, nothing official. But some of us are pretty smart. Once we had your name and address, finding out all about you wasn't too difficult.
"Yeah, well, you don't know everything."
"We will soon enough."
I calculated my odds of killing Gantry and getting away with it. Not good. Instead, I began driving to my home in silence, thinking of my next move, with Gantry along for the ride whether he wanted to be or not. Keeping your friends close and your enemies closer. He didn't complain. After several minutes of awkward silence, Gantry cleared his throat.
"It must have been hard coming upon the scene of that accident."
"What accident?" I asked, even though I already knew exactly what he meant. Gantry was poking the bear with a stick. He didn't seem to understand how close I was to reaching over and snapping his little fucking neck.
"Your son and your wife, you were on duty when they crashed. Got the call and went out there with your engine company. Didn't know it was them until you pulled up. Your son was already dead.
I gripped the steering wheel until it bent in my hands. Somehow I kept the car driving straight.
Your wife survived, but your marriage didn't. She left you a year later.
I turned. No! I made her leave. It was her goddamn fault. She ran the red light. She was the one not paying attention. Frederick died because of her. I got to say goodbye to her, but not to him.
I see,
Gantry said.
Is that what this is all about? Your wife? Your son?
Damn it. Gantry had used an emotional crowbar and pried me open like a cheap wooden crate. I could feel my heart slamming against my rib cage as my vision blurred. He finally seemed to sense that maybe he'd gone a little too far and changed his tack.
That waitress back at the restaurant, I think she possesses the Periculo Manus, the Hand of Danger. It's that stone she wears around her neck.
He looked at me, trying to gauge my reaction, but I was back in control of my emotions. He continued.
There's maybe 5 objects in the entire world with enough power to unbalance the universe this much. The Periculo Manus is one of them. It's been missing for 60 years until now.
Never heard of it.
And most people wouldn't have unless they're interested in that sort of thing. But now that I've mentioned it, you know what I'm talking about. After all, you've been texting her.
Great. They didn't just have the locations of where my phone had been, but also my text messages. There was nothing to be gained by responding to any more of his provocations, so I took a deep breath and simply drove. I had to admit, Gantry and his crew were good at what they did. If they were the police, I'd have been screwed. Maybe I was screwed anyway. It didn't really matter. All I cared about at that moment was my last day with my son, which would be happening shortly. Anything after that was meaningless. Gantry's gaze fell upon the lines of my face that had grown so much deeper over the previous few years. What they told him, I don't know. He finally broke the silence.
The Periculo Manus was last known to have been in the possession of a man named Tentinum, who was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people.
Yeah, I don't care. Gantry ignored me and continued.
You see, the hand grants many different abilities to its holder, but Tentinum was most interested in the ability to influence people, to bring out the worst in them, and make them do things they might not have otherwise done. He created psychopaths, serial killers, all sorts of homicidal maniacs who spewed death upon the land. Of course, none of the murders could actually be traced back to him, at least not by your typical Johnny Law type, because Tentinum never killed anyone himself. It's a very fascinating story, actually.
He was starting to agitate me again. I glanced down at my hands, which only an hour earlier had been wrapped around the throat of Jackson Rose, the 3rd person I'd killed.
Anyway,
Gantry continued,
to make a very long story short, it became obvious to some people what Tentinum was doing. I mean, if you study the occult, these things jump out at you when you see them. So a group of people got together and hunted Tentinum down. Not all of them survived, of course, but when they finally got to him, they killed him. And then they tried to burn his body, but it wouldn't burn. So instead, they tore it to pieces and buried them all in different parts of the world, just because they were so scared that somehow he'd return. As for the hand, it was never recovered. Tentinum didn't have it on him when they finally caught up to him. It just seemed to disappear.
And this group of people who killed Tentinum, this is the same group you're part of?
Oh, so you do care,
Gantry said as if he had scored some points in a non-existent game.
But to answer your question, no. They were mostly just regular people with regular lives. Once he was gone, there was nothing really holding them together as a group. But their story stayed alive, and it's been passed down.
I only care about your bullshit stories up to the point where they help me figure out who you are. Nothing less, nothing more.
You want to know who I am? I'm someone who's concerned about what's been going on, especially now that I know the Paraculomanus is involved. Do you know how dangerous that thing is? It feeds on death. The more death that surrounds it, the more powerful it becomes. The more powerful it becomes, the more death it causes. Its power to destroy can become virtually unlimited. Quite a vicious cycle, don't you think?
I caught the reflection of my face in the rearview mirror, complete with the bloody scratch running down my cheek. Was that the face of a truly guilty man? All I really wanted was some more time with my son. Just stop talking, I told Gantry. A few minutes later, I arrived at my house. I made a nodding motion toward the passenger door, inviting Gantry to get the heck out of my car once it stopped. He got the message and stepped out. Don't come back, I warned him as I locked the car and walked away. I didn't even glance back to see where the damn twerp wandered off to. There was no point in letting him think I cared. The next day, Frederick would be returned to me. That's all that mattered. As I tried to fall asleep that night, one thing Gantry spoke of kept me up. The Paraculomanus had the ability to influence people and bring out the worst in them. I grabbed my phone off my dresser and scrolled through the text messages I had exchanged with Gabriella. I went to the beginning, back to the time when she was just a stranger who contacted me completely out of the blue. I read that first text again. Sad? Miserable? I can help. The weird part is that I responded to it, to a text from an unknown person I had never met before. No matter. By that point, I was physically tired and emotionally drained. No more thoughts for me that night. I tossed my phone aside and let sleep find me. I had no big plans for the following day. No zoo, no amusement park, nothing. By this point, I'd learned that it would be safest to stay at home. We would play games and have fun with just each other. Frederick would return to me as a 4-year-old, which would be the perfect age for me to remember the shape of his face when he smiled. If I could just burn his smile into my memory, then everything would be worth it. I woke up in the morning to the sight of my beautiful child and gave him a big hug. The morning went great. Breakfast, games. I even let him watch a little TV, just so I could study his face and remember his features as he giggled at his shows. He had fish sticks for lunch and as much candy as he wanted once he was done with that. After lunch, we played with his car collection and then drew pictures. I was so engrossed in what we were doing that I almost didn't even notice when there was movement outside the living room window. That bastard Gantry was peering inside. I walked over to the door and flung it open, only to see a pale-looking Gantry staring back at me. I started to berate him. "Look here, you goddamn piece of..." He vomited on my porch before I could finish. I moved my feet to avoid the oncoming flood that was spreading over the ground. He wiped his face clean with his sleeve.
It's happening again. I can feel it. Whatever it is you're doing, you have to stop.
Jeez, don't you have a home? What do I need to do to get rid of you?
Just hear me out,
he panted.
We figured it out last night. It took some digging and some major hacking, but we know who the waitress is and why she has the Paraculo.
I don't care, I said as I slammed the door shut.
She's the granddaughter of Tentanum,
he shouted through the door.
She's dangerous.
I didn't respond, and eventually he wandered away from the house when it became clear I wasn't going to engage him any further. I went back to Frederick. My time with him was ticking down, and I didn't want to let Gantry waste any of it. Whatever concerns he'd raised about Gabriella didn't matter since I wasn't planning on utilizing her services any further. Even I knew when enough was enough. "Do you want to play a game?" I asked Frederick.
Can we play memory?
"Of course we can," I said. We played, and I rubbed his head and congratulated him when he beat me. But as our games and fun continued, the clock on the wall kept ticking. As the day wound down, it soon became time for Frederick's bath, which had always been one of his favorite parts of his day. I set him up in the tub with a whole set of new bath toys that I had ordered for him. I laughed at how cute he was, splashing around with all his toys, but my laughter was interrupted when I received a text from Mona.
Emmett is gone. I took a nap, and when I woke up, he wasn't in our hotel room. I've been out looking for him, but no luck. I'm really worried.
I nearly responded to her, but I didn't want to give Gantry and his group of hackers anything else to read. Once my day was done, I would go look for him. Frederick took a long bath, and when he finally got out, I dressed him in his pajamas. We still had a little time left, so I let him pick out a movie to watch before bed. Then, as we sat down on the couch, I heard a sound in the kitchen. Someone was rummaging through one of the drawers. I quickly shot up and darted to the kitchen, cursing the fact that somehow my day with Frederick was being interrupted yet again. I made it to the kitchen to see Emmett, who had apparently entered through the back door, holding a steak knife he had fished from the drawer. "Whoa, Emmett," I said, trying to calm both him and myself. Emmett stared straight ahead without any sort of acknowledgement toward me. "No," he said as he shook his head. "No." "What are you talking about, Emmett?" "You can't," he said. Before I could even respond, Emmett lunged at me with surprising speed and strength. Now, I'm a big guy, but somehow Emmett was able to knock me backwards as he ran into the living room. I fell to the floor as I heard Frederick screaming. In a panic, I righted myself and ran to Frederick, only to see that Emmett was holding him up with a knife to his throat. "It's okay, Emmett," I said with a calmness that I didn't truly feel. "Let's get you back home." Emmett just shook his head. "Don't you feel it? It's not right." "Emmett, please put the knife down," I pleaded. I could feel the beads of sweat beginning to coalesce on my brow. "That's Frederick. I know you don't really want to hurt him." Without another word, Emmett plunged the steak knife into Frederick's throat as red blood began to flow from the wound. I lunged forward, screaming at Emmett to stop as I collided with both of them. Emmett fell backwards to the living room floor as he lost his grasp on Frederick, who fell onto the couch. The next few minutes are hard for me to remember. My training kicked in and I switched to autopilot as I tended to Frederick's wounds. There was a great deal of blood, but I could still feel a strong pulse in his neck. Somewhere along the line I called 911, though I barely recall doing so. A few minutes later we left in an ambulance with me by Frederick's side as the EMTs worked to keep him stable. Meanwhile, I could hear great rumbles of thunder rolling over the sky as lightning flashed through the ambulance windows. The driver couldn't seem to stop commenting on the freaky weather that had appeared out of nowhere. The fact that it was just about time for Frederick to disappear certainly didn't escape me, yet somehow he remained, damaged but present. Frederick was admitted to the hospital for overnight observation. Amazingly, his jugular hadn't been severed, and a full recovery was expected. There were a ton of questions, of course. I answered them all. Frederick really shouldn't have been playing with that knife, I told the doctor. It was an awful mistake on my part that wouldn't be repeated. Then I said the same thing to the police officer who responded. And then I said it to the social worker as well. Why they believed me, I don't know, or even really care. It was morning before I finally started to regain some sense of myself. Even though I'd been awake all night by Frederick's bedside, I seemed to have a renewed sense of clarity. Frederick was still with me. For whatever reason, it seemed he had been returned to me for good. For a while, I didn't even think about the others. Emmett? I'm not even 100% sure what the hell happened to him after I knocked him to the ground. I vaguely remember him somewhat regaining his senses and crawling out of the house before the ambulance got there. Gabriella? What's left to say about her? I texted her to see if she could shed some light on what the hell was going on. She never wrote back. I visited her restaurant one last time and she wasn't there. She's gone. Who even cares? Once it became clear to me that Frederick was here to stay, I really didn't need her anyway. I wish I could say that Gantry disappeared too, but that pencil-necked little bastard showed up again, and with the same whiny little complaints about the universe being off balance. What does that even mean? One day, not too long after I'd brought Frederick home from the hospital, I glanced out of my living room window and saw him looking over the fence to my backyard, where Frederick was playing. I went outside and approached him from behind. He was so engrossed in watching Frederick on his swing set that he didn't even hear me until I cleared my throat and spoke. "If I see you here again, I'll kill you." I had my hands raised up, ready to wrap them around his throat if he said even the slightest wrong thing. He turned to look at me.
"That's not your son."
"Of course that's my son, and I don't want you bothering us any further."
"I finally figured out what you were doing. It's been said that one of the powers of the hand was bringing back the dead for a day. You used it for your son."
"You and your hacker buddies need to die. Leave us alone." I cracked my knuckles, wanting nothing more than to wrap my hands around his throat and end his life. I probably would have done it if we hadn't been outside in the open.
"You've unleashed something and you have no idea what you've done. Don't you understand? Your son had to be returned to the past. But his body couldn't be sent back with a stab wound on his neck. Instead, a duplicate was created in his place and only his soul returned. Meanwhile, his broken body stayed here. It was an empty vessel just waiting for something to inhabit it. And something did. Something got through all the cracks."
I stepped closer to Gantry, my fists clenched and shaken. He understood the threat as he stepped away from the fence.
"I'll go if you insist, but just remember that's not your son. Not anymore. I only wish I could have done something to stop this."
He started walking away, but in his typical fashion, he just had to get one more thing in.
"Oh, there have been a few murders around here lately."
He paused to gauge my reaction, but I gave him nothing.
"Do you know how they're related? They were all grandchildren of the people who killed Tentenum."
I just stared at him, and that was the end of the conversation. As he walked away, I resisted the urge to reach out and slam him to the ground. I just wanted to get on top of him and strangle him until he was nothing more than a limp sack of blood and bones. It would have felt so good, but I just barely held off this time. Once I was back inside my living room, I stood there with a smile as I looked outside and watched Frederick play. He really loved the new swing set I'd bought for him. Next to the swing set stood a brand new clubhouse that he liked to play in. Next to the clubhouse stood a new climbing structure. And right next to that, that's the spot in the planter bed where we buried the kitten I'd bought for him. Unfortunately, the kitten didn't last more than a day. When I saw Frederick carrying around its limp body, and I asked him what happened, he just laughed hysterically and then said he had shaken it too hard. That's okay. I guess he just wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. I'm sure it was only an accident, and I know he'll be more careful in the future. The important thing is that I have my son back. I won. I looked the universe in the eye, and the goddamn universe blinked. And now, I'll do anything to protect him, to allow him to grow up and reach his full potential. Whatever that may be.
Shorty Small, a man neither short nor small, slept fitfully. With the covers thrown off, perspiration continued to soak his pillow and sheets. The woman who slept next to him grew concerned and gently shook his shoulder. "Shorty, wake up." Disoriented, he mumbled something unintelligible and his eyes fluttered open. "Huh?" "You're having another nightmare." She placed her hand on his forehead. "And it feels like you have a fever." His rapid breathing slowed as he batted his eyes to fully wake up. "Damn, didn't mean to wake you, Claire." "I'm worried about you. This is the 4th night in a row you've experienced one." "Just a phase. It'll pass." "This phase has lasted 4 weeks. I think it's time you saw a doctor." His right hand automatically felt the ragged purplish 1-inch scar on his left wrist. The area felt warmer than the surrounding skin. "I'll be okay. No need to waste their time. Besides, I haven't got one here in New Orleans." "I'll make an appointment for you with my primary care doctor." "She's a woman." "So?" Claire, I wouldn't feel comfortable going to a female doctor." "Why not?" I don't know. It'd be weird." "Why?" The big man remained quiet. "You don't have a reason, do you?" "Other than the fact it'd be weird, no." "You might actually like going to her. She's very good." Claire?" "Shorty, I can't find anything physically wrong that would cause your sleeplessness." Dr. Ruth Morgan pointed to the computer monitor above her desk in the examination room. "Besides a slightly elevated white blood counts, your blood pressure, heart rate, reflexes, and metabolic measures are all normal." She turned to Claire. "Have either of you had a cold or flu-like symptoms recently?" "No. Like I told you earlier, he has bouts of tossing and turning. During those episodes, he perspires profusely while he thrashes about." She looked at the monitor again. "Were you in the military, Shorty?" "Yes, but I never deployed." "Okay." She folded her arms. "A CT scan or an MRI would be our next best bet." Claire placed her hand on Shorty's arm. "Then let's schedule one or both." Small gave her a quick glance and then returned his attention to the doctor. "What good will that do?" "It would tell us if you have anything abnormal in your brain." "Beside the brain itself?" She smiled at the comment. "Ha ha, never heard that one before." "No, seriously, why do I need one?" "It could tell us if you've had a stroke or restricted blood flow in the brain. You probably don't, but I'd rather err on the side of caution." "Okay, go ahead, schedule it." The doctor noticed the scar on his left palm. "When did that happen?" "About a month ago." She reached for his hand and examined the ragged scar. "Did an animal do this?" "Don't remember." She pursed her lips and narrowed her eyes. "Really? You don't remember? Where did it occur?" "By you?" Her frown grew. "This could explain the elevated white blood counts. I need to take a biopsy. It looks infected." Small returned the frown. "What do you mean infected?" The doctor did not answer. She stepped out of the room. Claire watched her leave and then turned to Shorty. She grabbed his hand and studied the wound. "Did a dog do this?" Small shrugged. "Shorty, you need to tell me the truth. How did you get this wound?" "Well, it wasn't really a dog." 2 days later. Shorty Small opened his eyes when he heard someone enter his hospital room. Claire smiled as she stood over him and squeezed his hand. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Better than yesterday." "Have you seen the doctor?" He nodded. "She breezed through here about 6:30 and said I could probably go home this afternoon or early tomorrow." "Good." Claire narrowed her eyes. "What else did she say?" Shorty, I can always call her office." He looked at her and then at his hands. "She said it wasn't rabies like she first thought. They don't know what caused the spike in my white blood cell count the first day I was here. It's back to normal this morning. The MRI didn't show anything strange either." "That's good news." Claire took his left hand and looked at the scar. "This looks less angry. Did she say anything about it?" "No, she did tell me to stay out of the swamp for a couple of months." "What about working for the tourism board?" "Homer stopped by last night after you went home. They're giving me paid sick leave." "That's even better." "I thought I'd try to finish up the third floor remodel while I'm off." "Don't you think you should rest instead?" "And go stir crazy? No, thank you. It will be more relaxing if I'm busy. Besides, working on the remodel will keep me out of the bayou." He said this last comment with a mischievous smile. The whine of a circular saw spooled down as Shorty measured the board one more time to make sure he got the measurement correct. From behind him, he heard an unfamiliar voice call to him. "Shorty Small." He turned. No one stood at the entrance to the third floor. With a frown, he walked over to the doorway and peered down the staircase. "Hello?" No answer. "Claire, was that you?" Still no answer. He shrugged and returned to the sawhorses in the middle of the soon-to-be living area. "Shorty Small." He spun around. Once again, no one was there. "Claire, it's not funny." He propped the board he had just cut against the sawhorse and returned to the doorway. No one could be seen on the stairs. The sound of a piece of lumber clattering on the floor caused him to spin around. The board he had just worked on lay 10 feet from where he had left it. What the hell? A cold pocket of air breezed past him, heading toward the stairwell. He followed until he reached the first floor containing Claire's retail shop. The stillness within the space seemed unusual for this time of the day. He remembered she closed the shop to attend a meeting held by the Chamber of Commerce. Placing his hands on his hips, he heard the jingle of the bell above the shop entrance. The door had not opened. "Did you recognize the voice, Shorty?" Small picked at his meal. "No, I didn't." When Claire returned home late, they decided to go out for dinner. In between ordering and receiving their food, the big man told her about his encounter earlier in the afternoon. "You said the voice was male." He nodded. "The only person to ever die in that house was my grandmother, but her spirit's been exorcised." "I know." He paused, took a sip of his beer, and then asked, "Can ghosts or spirits travel away from the area where they died, Claire?" She put her glass of wine down and gave him a chuckle. "Did I just hear you right? You act like you believe in ghosts." "For the sake of not getting into an argument, I'm considering all possibilities." "I'm marking this day down on my calendar. What changed your mind?" "Let's just say I had an encounter in the bayou. Can ghosts travel far from where they died?" "Of course. Why couldn't they?" "I've always heard they couldn't." She shook her head. "That's a myth." "This whole town seems to be a myth." After another chuckle, Claire grew serious. "There have been thousands of first-hand accounts of individuals encountering deceased loved ones miles from where the individuals died. So yes, ghosts or spirits can travel." "So there's a difference between a ghost and a spirit?" She took a deep breath and sighed. "A spirit is the essence of a living force that leaves the body when it dies. A spirit is said to be the soul before it ascends to the afterlife. A ghost is referred to a soul who is stuck between the living and the hereafter. It's marooned, so to speak." "Huh. Is that important, Shorty?" "Don't know. What happens to the soul of a werewolf? Once a werewolf dies, its body converts back to human form, and the soul is released. She folded her arms. Okay, Mr. Small, what's going on? Ever since we met, you've considered the spirituality of New Orleans nothing more than a joke. I still do. But, can we change the subject? You started it? Small rubbed his eyes, placed his elbows on the table, and made a steeple with his hands. I might have been a little hasty about a few things. He pointed toward the scar on his left wrist. To this day, I don't know how I got this, but it was the night I killed something large in the bayou. Her eyes widened and a hand involuntarily covered her mouth. She reached for his hand and held it. Shorty, what did you kill? Lowering his voice, he leaned toward her. A rougarou. Her gasp could be heard throughout the restaurant. They walked a circuitous route back to her shop. Neither said a word for the first 10 minutes, he with his hands in his pockets and she holding his right arm. Finally, Claire said, A full moon occurred last week. You would have changed then if the wound came from a true rougarou. Are you sure that's what it was? Taking a deep breath, Small blew it out slowly. Yeah, it was a rougarou. I did a lot of research on it before I went out that night. A gypsy named Adriana Nika told me how to kill it. She also gave me a potion to help attract it. Then you should seek her advice again, Shorty. He fell back into silence as they continued to walk the streets of the French Quarter. After another 5 minutes, he looked at Claire. When I spoke to her, she said that if I were bitten, I would become cursed as well. He looked at his wound. This doesn't look like a bite. No, it looks more like a ragged scratch. Kind of what I thought. Even with all the flurry of those few moments, I don't see how the creature could have bit me. Like I said, seek out Madame Adriana. Yeah, probably a good idea. Claire trained her attention to the big man who walked beside her. Shorty, are you losing your skepticism? He returned her gaze. From the illumination of the various streetlights they passed, he realized his feelings for this woman were growing deeper with each passing day. Skepticism has helped keep me alive for a long time, so no, I've not lost it. But the more I spend here in New Orleans, the more I'm learning how to accept the weirdness. I'm part of New Orleans. Am I weird? This was said with a slight smile. No, you're one of the more normal aspects of the place. Good. Then you may sleep with me again tonight. I had planned on something more than sleep. She giggled and held his arm tighter. The next day, Henry Dumont tilted his head and looked at his big friend. You're kidding, right? Nope. The lanky Cajun guide leaned over and spit a brownish wad of something onto the ground. He then tucked his thumbs in the suspender straps of his faded denim overalls. Why the hell would you want to go back out in the bayou? I need to talk to Madame Adriana. Why? She's the only one who knew how to find the rougarou. No one's seen it or heard from it since you went out that night. Small shrugged. I don't like gypsies. Didn't ask you to go. I just need to rent your airboat. You remember how to get to their island? Haven't forgotten. It'll cost you. Figured. How much? How long you planning to be gone? As long as it takes. Dumont chuckled. Seeing how it's slow today. Have it back by late afternoon and you can take it. He smiled. Free of charge. Thanks, Henry. Be sure you bring it back in one piece. Goes without saying. An hour later, Shorty Small sat in the small bungalow of Adriana Nika on decorative pillows in the center of a very large living area. A breeze flowed through open windows, creating a comfortable interior despite the warm, humid day. She looked at Small and said, We never thanked you for ridding the swamp of the rougarou. No need. She smiled and reached for his hand. Let me see your wrist. He offered his hand. She held it gently in both of hers and traced the length of the scar with an index finger. This is not the bite of a rougarou. You are not cursed. How can you tell? You would not have a hand. Good point. Tell me something, Madam Adriana. I will try. Can you tell me what happened to the soul of the creature after I burned the body and placed the ashes in the swamp? Why do you ask, my son? Because I believe it paid me a visit the other day. Her eyebrows rose, but she remained quiet. Small continued. I heard a voice call my name twice, but no one was there. A cold breeze passed by, and I followed it downstairs. There's a small bell on the front door of the shop my girlfriend owns, and it rang, but the door did not open. Has this happened before? No. It knew your name? Yes. Who would have used your name around the creature? I don't recall Henry or myself using our names. Then how would the creature know? I don't see how it could. Then this spirit is that of another soul. Let me see your palm again. He offered his hand and she softly held it. After several minutes of silence studying his palm, she looked up. As I told you last time, you are a hunter, correct? He nodded. A hunter of men, no? I work for the tourism board. She smiled. Yes, you've said that. But at one time, you made your living hunting men for money. Not proud of it, but yes, I did. Were you good at it? He shrugged. I got by. She stood and wandered into the small kitchen off one side of the room where they sat. After a short interval, she returned to her pillow. She offered him a silver chain with what appeared to be a round disc and an embedded jewel resembling a glass eye. Are you a religious man, Shorty Small? Never had much use for it. Why? But you are truthful. Most individuals, when offered a talisman, will profess being religious. She handed him the object. This will protect you from evil spirits. What evil spirits? The spirits of those you've hunted. The grin became a frown. Excuse me? Did these men deserve to die? Tilting his head to the side, Shorty debated within himself what to tell this woman. After a slight pause, he decided on the truth. As far as I was told, yes, they did. What were their crimes? Some victimized children, others their girlfriends or wives. The majority were murderers or thieves who escaped justice. The old woman nodded as she reached for his hand again, palm up. She studied it carefully and then looked at him. I sense you are a man of your word, Shorty Small. Someone my people can trust. Spirits who are caught between this world and the next may try to harm you. Wear this talisman to protect yourself and the woman you love. How did... Never mind. With his free hand, he held up the necklace and stared at the emerald eye. Shorty, there is one more task you must complete. If you can identify who this spirit is, you must do one thing, she told him. He nodded as she spoke. When she finished, he asked, May I seek your guidance again someday? Yes, you may, but it will be sooner than you think. 2 weeks later. With the framing part of the third floor remodel complete, Small ran electrical wiring to the various rooms. The previous week, a licensed plumber installed PVC pipes and copper tubing for the master bathroom. As twilight progressed outside, Small checked his watch. With a frown, he walked downstairs to the shop and found it empty. Claire never closed the store this early. He retrieved his cell phone from his back jean pocket and pressed the send icon below her number. No answer. He walked out the rear door where they parked their vehicles. His Ford Escape remained in its normal spot, but Claire's Chevy Equinox spot remained empty. He pulled out his cell phone again and called her one more time. On the fifth ring, he heard a distant metallic voice answer, Shorty Small. Who is this? He heard thunder in the background and then a crackle of static. I have Claire. Where the hell is she? The static-laced voice said, Claire's air is scarce. Rush you must, or she will be no more. The call ended, and Small ran back into the building. OnStar, how can we assist? I need a location of a VIN number. Small recited the 17 characters and Claire's PIN number. He continued, This is an emergency. Just a moment, sir. Shorty Small sat in his Ford Escape and waited. His left heel bounced on the floor mat. Sir, we have a notification of the vehicle's airbags deploying a few minutes ago southeast of New Orleans. First responders are en route. Do you have a GPS unit? Yes, give me the coordinates. Can you communicate with the occupant? No, sir. Please let the first responders know her fiancé is en route. She may be seriously hurt. Understood. He ended the call and backed out of his parking slot. Highway 39 follows the Mississippi River south until it ends a few miles from the Gulf. As Small rounded a corner, flashing lights and numerous first responder vehicles could be seen to his left. In amongst these SUVs and trucks, he noticed Claire's Equinox, the front smashed and resting against a telephone pole. Sliding his Ford to a stop, he rushed out of the vehicle and encountered a sheriff's department deputy he knew from his work with the tourism board. The man stopped him and said, She's alive, Shorty, but hurt. How bad? She's stable and getting ready to be taken to a hospital. Small's eyes did not wander from the gurney being loaded into an ambulance. Do you know what happened, Cliff? The St. Bernard Parish deputy sheriff shook his head. She hasn't spoken to anyone yet. There isn't a lot of traffic this far south. When we first got here, she was barely breathing. They got her out of the vehicle and stabilized her. Small watched as the ambulance spun up its siren and accelerated toward the north. What hospital, Cliff? University Medical Center. Thanks, I'll follow the ambulance. Shorty, do you know why she would be this far out in the boonies? No, but I intend to find out. The following morning, Small dozed in the chair next to Claire's hospital bed. After telling the night nurse he and the patient were engaged, she relented and allowed him to stay in the room. Around 4 a.m, he heard, Shorty, is that you? He stood and moved next to the bed. Yes, Claire. In the dim light of the room, he could see her smile. Good. We have to stop meeting like this. With a chuckle, he reached for her hand. What happened? I don't know. I was in the shop and got a call from someone claiming they owned some rare gemstones I needed to look at. What did the voice sound like? She shook her head. It was a bad connection. There was so much static I could barely understand what they said. Male voice? I think so. She paused and squeezed his hand. The address he gave me didn't exist, so I was headed back. I turned the corner and saw someone standing in the middle of the road. I remember swerving to miss them. Everything else is blank until just now. It's been almost 15 hours. You're banged up pretty bad. Let's go back to the voice. Did it sound like it was a long way off? A nod became his answer. At that moment, a nurse walked into the room. Good to see you awake, Ms. Honoré. Your fiancé has not left your side since you arrived. She busied herself with the things nurses do as Claire stared at Small. When the nurse left, she said, Fiancé? Small shrugged. Had to tell them something so they'd let me stay. She closed her eyes, rested her head on the pillow, and smiled ever so slightly. At a few minutes after 7, Claire's doctor entered the room. How are we feeling this morning, Claire? I have a headache and my side hurts, Dr. Morgan. That's because you have a slight concussion and 4 broken ribs. Small stood off to the side with his arms folded. The doctor felt Claire's wrist as she studied the vital signs monitor. Any dizziness? Yes. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad? 9. Think you can stand? She shook her head. I tried earlier. Had to use the bedpan. Okay, I think I'll keep you here for another day. We'll revisit going home tomorrow. She turned to Small. I understand you've been here all night. The big man nodded. Go home and get some rest. She'll be busy until mid-afternoon with tests. They'll take good care of her. Small looked at Claire. When she nodded, he followed the doctor out of the room. When the door closed and they were in the hall, Dr. Morgan said, The broken ribs are going to cause her to be uncomfortable for a while. She's going to need assistance with everything. Bathing, using the restroom, dressing. Can you provide it? That's the plan. She patted him on his chest. Good, now go home, relax, and get some rest. You're going to need it. After a long hot shower, Shorty stared into the mirror and rubbed his 5-day-old beard. He spread shaving cream over his whiskers and began to scrape them off. After several strokes, he looked down to rinse the razor. When he raised his gaze back to the mirror, the face of a long-dead Mark stood behind him, staring at his image. The specter's lips moved. You're next, Shorty Small. Small whirled around. Empty space and a cold pocket of air greeted him, causing him to shiver. Son of a bitch. He turned to check the mirror again. Nothing. Only his shaving cream-covered face returned the gaze. He finished shaving, washed off the remaining foam, and returned to the bedroom to dress. An hour later, he sat in the chair next to Claire's hospital bed watching as she slept. Her chest rose and deflated in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Occasionally, her face would grimace as the broken ribs made their presence known. A bluish-purple bruise could be seen on her forehead. It disappeared beneath her hairline. Under her eyes, dark circles spread down her cheeks, revealing more of the trauma she experienced as her Chevy struck the telephone pole. With each passing second, his anger grew as he watched her sleep. He stood and pulled out his cell phone. Homer LaCroix answered. Heard about Claire. How is she? Alive. I need a favor, Homer. Sure. What is it? I have to be out of town for a day or so. I need to hire a nurse to stay with Claire while I'm gone. No problem. When? She's probably going home tomorrow morning. As soon as I can get her settled, I'm heading out. 2 days later. A simple white gravestone marked the burial site of one George Russell. The date of his death and name were the only inscriptions visible. Having spent most of his life in prison for petty theft and burglary, he also held the distinction of being a sexual predator and child molester. Shorty Small stood over the grave and remembered the hit. A heavy drizzle kept everything wet. The glare of streetlights dimmed as the moisture swallowed what little illumination they provided. He stood in the recesses of an alley across the street from a honky-tonk bar on the south side of Chicago near Inglewood. A suppressed Ruger SR-22 remained hidden in the pocket of his rain parka. The weapon, his go-to gun for these types of assignments, provided a bit of solace. Waiting for his marks to emerge from a bar, office building, or wherever they might be, was always the hardest aspect of his chosen profession. Tonight's cold light rain made it miserable. A loner by habit, Small rarely talked to anyone except the individual who assigned him his jobs. He knew nothing of the man, and over the course of 7 years, could remember less than 2 lengthy conversations. Their normal pattern was to meet on a park bench in Grant Park near Lake Michigan. The man would be there reading a newspaper. If the paper was folded in his lap, Shorty would continue to walk. If the paper was open and a large manila envelope lay on the bench beside him, he would sit. After 2 minutes, the man would fold the paper, stand and walk away. The envelope would remain. Seeing the envelope, Shorty would pick it up and pretend to try to return it to the man who would already have disappeared. That night's assignment, George Russell, could be classified as just another job. Nothing special about him other than he was a child molester and a sexual predator. Shorty's conscience would remain clear after completion. At 5 minutes before 1 a.m., the Mark walked out of the bar. After looking up and down the street, he bent his head and lit a cigarette. The only thing Small remembered thinking was, while cigarettes are bad for your health, a silenced pistol is usually worse. The man turned to his right and walked north. After a few moments, Shorty followed. 5 blocks later, Russell crossed the street and saw Small hunched over and walking in the rain. He stopped to let the big man pass. As he did, Small pulled a Ruger and leveled it even with Russell's forehead. The gun spat twice, and Shorty kept walking. His pace never changed. The image of the surprised man's face would remain with him for a long time. Now, a decade later, standing over the grave, his anger flared. This was the creep who caused Claire's accident. Bending down, the ex-hitman dug beneath the grass and filled a Ziploc bag with dirt from the gravesite. Without another thought, he stood and returned to his rental car for his trip to the airport. 12 hours later, he arrived at the second-floor apartment above the retail shop he shared with Claire. "How are you feeling this morning?" Claire smiled as Small handed her a cup of coffee. "Better now that you are home." "She wasn't that bad, was she?" "No, but I would rather have you here. I feel safer." He touched the bruise on her forehead. "This looks better." After taking a sip of her coffee, Claire shook her head. "It looked worse to me." "That's because you've never had that severe of a bruise. Trust me, it's looking better." "Where do you have to go today?" "Thought I'd stay here and work on the 3rd floor. Do you need to go somewhere?" She shook her head slowly and sipped her coffee again. "No." After a lengthy pause, she continued. "I'm thinking about selling the shop and the building." He folded his arms. "Okay. What are you planning to do after you sell the shop?" She shrugged. "Claire?" "I really don't know, Shorty. This place is starting to scare me. My grandmother died here. Ghosts seem to have inhabited the place, and I keep getting hurt." "This shop is all you've ever done, Claire. Besides, I haven't finished the 3rd floor." "Doesn't matter. I spoke to a real estate broker the other day. She said we could get at least $1.2 million for the entire building, even with the 3rd floor unfinished." He sat on the side of the bed and kept his attention on her. "What am I supposed to do if you sell this place?" "We buy something together, silly." "Claire, I'm not much of a catch. You might want to rethink your options." She shook her head. "I have thought about it. In fact, it's all I've thought about for the past month." "It's your building. You need to do what's best for you." "Best for us, Shorty." "Claire, I can live anywhere. If that's what you want to do, I'm good with it." She smiled and reached for him. With a grimace, she stopped when her ribs delivered a sharp reminder about being broken. After the pain subsided, she said, "That reminds me. I need to buy a new car." "Let's make sure it has OnStar." "Why?" "It saved your life." 4 weeks later. "I like the place, Shorty." "Works for me too, I checked. This part of East Carrollton was above the floodwaters of Katrina." "Only you would check on that." He shrugged. "Doesn't hurt to know." She hugged his arms as she surveyed the living area. "Let's make the offer you and I discussed." "Fine with me. Why don't you go to the car and call the agent? I want to check on something while you're talking to her." Once she left, Small remained alone in the empty house. He pulled the Ziploc bag out of his coat pocket and sprinkled dirt from George Russell's grave across the front door sill. He repeated the process on the 2 other exterior doors. He then joined Claire outside. Since returning from his trip to Chicago, the ghost of George Russell remained absent. While the thought of burning sage on all floors of Claire's building seemed silly at the time, it appeared to have helped keep the specter away. He leaned against the front fender of Claire's new Chevy Blazer while he listened to her discuss the house with the real estate agent. With his arms folded, he surveyed the property. Above the front porch, his attention was drawn to one of the Creole cottage-style home's dormers. Through the glass, he could see the image of George Russell, his eyes black orbs, and he appeared to be laughing. Moving day. Small took another tour of the unfinished 3rd floor, making sure he left no tools behind. He took pictures of each room and then headed to the 2nd floor. Everything there had been packed and transferred to a moving van. It now traveled toward their new house. He made one last swing through the empty rooms, taking pictures of each. On the retail floor, everything remained as is, the new owner having purchased both the shop and building. Just as he reached the bottom of the stairs on the first floor, he heard a crash and the sound of breaking glass. A high-pitched laugh followed, and another display case collapsed to the floor. "Shorty Small, Shorty Small. You will never be rid of me, Shorty Small." "George!" Small's voice boomed in the now quiet first floor. He stood on the bottom step of the staircase. "Do I have your attention?" He held the bag of dirt from the grave above his head. "This soil is from your grave in Chicago. Be gone, or it will cover your spirit here in New Orleans, trapping your soul for eternity." He could not believe he had just spoken the words Madame Adriana had instructed him to say. Standing perfectly still, he did not hear a sound or detect a cold breeze. After another 10 minutes of quiet, he walked to the back door, got in his car, and drove away from the French Quarter. Arriving at the new house just as the moving van drove away, he entered and found Claire unpacking dishes in the kitchen. She smiled as he walked in. "Did we get everything from the building?" "You could say that." "Let's play it safe. Why don't you burn some sage in all the rooms? You know, just in case." "I don't believe in all that crap." "Of course you don't. Then why did the second floor smell like sage for the past month?" "I like the fragrance." She laughed. "Why couldn't we have met at our regular diner in the French Quarter, Shorty? This place has better coffee and beignets. Plus, their po' boys are excellent." 6'5", real thin, hawk nose, and long curly salt and pepper hair, Homer LaCroix sat across from Small in the cafe a few blocks from the house Claire and he recently purchased. "Since I'm the one who has to drive the furthest, you're buying." "Fine." Their food arrived and LaCroix asked, "How's the new house?" "Comfortable." "Claire not scared anymore?" He took a bite of the shrimp po' boy and his eyes widened. "You're right. These are better." "She's fine, Homer. Why the meeting?" "Did you hear about Claire's old building?" Since he was in the middle of chewing, Small shook his head. "Burned last night." Lowering the sandwich, the big man wiped his mouth and swallowed. "Do they know why?" "Fire marshal said the blaze started on the 3rd floor. They believe it was an electrical fire." Small laughed out loud. "Bullshit! The wiring up there wasn't connected to anything." LaCroix raised an eyebrow. "You mean you didn't finish hooking it up?" "Not unless the new owners did. Homer, when Claire decided to sell the place, I stopped. The only thing I did was run wiring to the main living area. I hadn't even stripped the wires for the connection boxes yet." "Do you have proof?" "Why?" "New owners believe someone sabotaged the building. Since you were the last one there, fingers are being pointed at you." Small pulled out his cell phone. He opened the gallery and showed it to LaCroix. "Thumb your way through those. Note the timestamp on the pictures. I took them just before I left. I've been with Claire ever since. That, sir, is my alibi." Handing the phone back to the big man, LaCroix smiled. "I told him you didn't do it. Can you send those to me?" "I can." Leaning back in his chair, Small asked, "When did this happen?" "Over the weekend." That would have given the new owners plenty of time to screw something up in the wiring. "It would, but they left town after the closing and didn't return until yesterday." Folding his arms, Small narrowed his eyes. "Lots of homeless people in the French Quarter, Homer. If the building was unoccupied, someone broke in and started the fire. That's the other theory the fire department's working with." He paused. "Tourism board has a job for you." Returning to his sandwich, Small remained quiet as he chewed. "They want you to find the person doing all the vandalism that's been going on in the French Quarter." "Thought they had all kinds of security cameras around there." "They do." "And?" LaCroix leaned over the table and said in a very low voice, "Security cameras are catching the vandalism as it's being done." He handed his phone to Shorty. "Only picture of the vandal is this one." Small studied the blurry image. The black orbs for eyes identified the figure. They have an image of the guy, why not turn it over to the police? Police can't identify him from this grainy picture and, as usual, are dragging their feet on the investigation. It's probably the same person who set Claire's old building on fire. That's been suggested as well. Homer, are you telling me they want me to find this person and get rid of him? I knew you were a quick study. How much? Normal fee. I need to fly to Chicago. That'll be extra. Why? The answer to who this guy is might be there. Not following you, big guy. Take my word for it, the answer is in Chicago. Okay, then no problem. Taking another bite of his sandwich, Small shook his head and mumbled, "Shit." The big man spent the next day in the library of Tulane University. Carmen Fowler, Ph.D. in anthropology at the school, met him there after her last class of the day. "Short is small. What has the tourism board got you doing this time?" "Chasing ghosts." She chuckled. "Seriously?" He nodded. "Isn't that like chasing rabbits?" "Rabbits would be easier." "I thought you'd already done that for them." "That was a witch." "Oh." She smiled and led him out of the library. "Let's talk outside." As they strolled the campus, she continued, "Who's the ghost?" "A criminal named George Russell. He's buried in Chicago." She frowned and shot a quick glance at him. "You actually know whose ghost it is?" He nodded. "I dealt with him in Chicago. He showed up in my mirror a few weeks ago." "So, you know him?" "I don't know him, but I've dealt with him." "Do you know what his crimes were?" "Child molester, sexual predator, and spent most of his adult life in prison." "Nice." They walked in silence for a few moments. "Does he have any relatives?" "No idea why." "You'll need something personal of someone he loved, preferably a girlfriend or wife." "Why?" "Shorty, if you need to catch a ghost, you'll have to have bait." He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I discovered this afternoon he was never married, so that means girlfriend." "Or, think about it, Shorty. If he was a sexual predator, he might have had an obsession with someone. That would probably work as well." The big man displayed a slight smile. "Yes, Professor, it just might. In fact, it might work better." They continued walking and talking for another hour. Chicago. "Who'd you say you're with?" Shorty Small smiled. "Private investigator from New Orleans, Ms. Newman." The petite woman looked at the business card handed to her by the big man. "Well, he's not dead. I don't care what they say. I've seen him. When I do, he's staring at me like he did that night he assaulted me." "So you don't believe he's dead?" She shook her head rapidly. "Hell no. I see him all the time. Sometimes he's standing on a street corner watching me as I drive by. Sometimes I see him in the grocery store. Creeps me out. I went to the circuit court to get a restraining order, but they laughed at me. Hard to get an order if the court believes the SOB is dead. He's been spotted in New Orleans as well." "Whatever." She paused and took a drag on her cigarette. "So, why are you here?" "Ms. Newman, may I call you Beverly?" "If you want to." "Beverly, this may sound odd, but do you have anything personal he would recognize?" She took another drag and stared at Small while she blew the smoke out. "Are you some kind of pervert?" With a smile, Small shook his head. "No, I was hoping you might still have a necklace or bracelet he would recognize." She remained quiet as she studied the floor of her apartment. "He ripped them off of me. I don't know what happened to them." After a deep breath, she looked up. "I don't know why, but I kept the bra. Do you want that?" "If you're willing to part with it." "You're welcome to it. Not sure why I kept the damn thing in the first place." Beverly Newman left the living area of her apartment and disappeared. She emerged a few minutes later with a pink-laced bra. At one time, this was my favorite. I've never worn it again. I'll put it in a sack for you." She handed him the garment, now hidden by a plastic Target bag. "Thank you, Beverly. I'll return it when we're done." "Don't worry about it. I don't want it back. Just put him in jail for the rest of his life. That's my goal." The clerk at the UPS store looked at the scale. 65 pounds. What's in it? Small smiled. "Dirt." Looking over his glasses at the big man, the middle-aged clerk said, "Did you say dirt?" "Yes, I said dirt." "Sir, it will cost you $85 to ship to New Orleans." "That's okay." He offered him an American Express card from the tourism board. "This must be some kind of special soil." "Yes, very special." "Okay, should be there on Friday." "Thank you." Shorty Small walked out of the UPS store and checked his watch. 4 hours until his flight back to New Orleans. Time to return to the airport. The sun poured through the east-facing window in the bedroom he shared with Claire. Small reached over, but her side of the bed was empty. He glanced at his watch on the nightstand and saw the time to be a few minutes past 7. As he stood, he smelled the familiar odor of her blend of freshly ground coffee. When he entered the kitchen, she was staring out the window above the sink. "Coffee smells good." Turning, she smiled. "Just finished brewing." "You're up early. What's going on?" He reached for a cup in the cabinet and filled it with the dark liquid. "I've been thinking." "Last time you did that, we moved." She smiled and took a sip of her coffee. "I know." He remained quiet, waiting for her to continue. "The house is paid for, and we have plenty of money to keep us going for a few years. Tulane is only a few blocks from here." "Let me guess. You want to go back to school." "Is that silly of me, Shorty?" "Nope. It might be your last chance. What are you interested in doing?" "Gemology." "Claire, you don't have to go to someplace like Tulane to become a gemologist." She had turned away from the window as she spoke to him. Suddenly, the image of George Russell appeared from behind the glass. His eyes resembled empty black orbs, and he snarled with bared teeth. The window rattled, which drew Claire's attention. By the time she turned around, the ghost no longer appeared in the window. "What was that, Shorty?" "Wind." Returning to their bedroom, Small entered the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at his own image in the mirror. His appearance startled him. Puffy dark circles under his eyes appeared where none were before. Even during the loneliest days as a hitman, his appearance never looked this haggard. Getting on the bathroom scales, he noted his weight down by 20 pounds. As he turned on the shower, he mumbled to himself, "God damn, George Russell, your days are numbered." A knock at the door reminded him of it being locked. When he opened it, Claire stood in front of him, her robe open. "You look like you could use your back scrub this morning." The next day, Small eased the airboat onto the island in the middle of the bayou. Madame Adriana stood waiting for him as he secured the boat with a rope. "I take it you have returned to discuss the spirit which haunts you?" "That's correct, Madame Adriana." He handed her an envelope, which she accepted. "That is a small token of my appreciation for your help these past few months." She slipped the package into a pocket of her dress without looking at the contents. "Let us convene this discussion inside." He followed the diminutive woman back to her cottage in the small village. When they were seated on the pillows, she raised her hand, palm up. Shorty placed his left hand there. After a few minutes of studying his wound, she released it. "You wish to know how to capture the spirit of the one who haunts you, yes?" He nodded. After taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and slowly exhaled. "You have dirt from his grave, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "You have an article from someone he loves or obsesses over, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." She stood and left the sitting area of the house. When she returned, she held a metal container the size of a large shoebox. The vessel featured swirling colors painted on all sides. The pattern reminded him of the colorful dress she wore. As she handed it to him, she explained, "Place this box in the middle of a room and fill it halfway with the dirt you collected. Surround it with candles and turn the lights off in the room." "What are the candles for?" "First, they will attract the spirit. Secondly, they will tell you when the spirit is near the box." He nodded. "You must be vigilant, Shorty Small. The spirit will suspect you are setting a trap for it. You told me the last time we met, you are not a religious man." "I said I didn't have much use for it. That doesn't mean I don't believe in God." The old woman smiled. "Then the spirit will test your faith. Do you still wear the talisman I gave you?" He pulled it out from under his shirt. "Then it cannot harm you physically. It will try to pretend it can, but it cannot." He nodded. "Did you acquire an infrared thermometer?" "I did." "Good. Spirits are pure energy. They feed on the surrounding heat to survive. You have told me you have felt the cold air when a lost soul passes, have you not?" "I have." "This is the key to capturing it." She proceeded to tell him how. When she finished, he asked, "When I have apprehended the spirit, what then?" "Bury it on sacred ground." "Kind of hard to do in New Orleans. Cemeteries are above ground." "Place the box in a crypt within a church." "What kind of church?" She handed him a small piece of paper. "Contact this individual and show her your talisman. I will let her know to accept the box without question. She will know what to do with it." He smiled. The following night, a detached garage behind the new home of Claire Honoré and Shorty Small became the location for capturing the ghost of George Russell. Small placed the colorfully decorated box in the middle of the building's floor. He then scooped enough of the dirt collected in Chicago into the empty container to fill it halfway. With this accomplished, he placed candles in a circle around it and lit them. He then checked the batteries of the infrared thermometer gun and turned it on. With this accomplished, he sat on a wooden high-back chair and waited. He watched a full moon rise in an east-facing window until it rose out of sight at the top. He neither checked the time nor did he move. With Claire at a friend's house for the night, he did not have to worry about her. By his guess, the time was past midnight when he sensed a change in the surrounding air. The window facing the west rattled, and he felt a cool breeze passing by, and then the east window rattled. He took a slow breath as he calmed his nerves. "Shorty Small." The voice was tinny and angry. The cool breeze blew past him again. "Shorty Small." The voice contained more anger. "What do you want, George Russell?" His tone defiant and loud. "Your soul." With a grin, Small shook his head. "Can't have it." A snarling hooded ghoul appeared in front of him, laughed, and flew past. Small closed his eyes as the image shot by him. The air grew colder. He could feel his heart thumping, but he kept his cool. Turning on the infrared thermometer, he pointed it at the box. The ambient temperature within the container read 72 degrees. Small called out, "You can't scare me, George. You're the one who should be scared." A macabre cackle could be heard and the windows rattled again. The image of George Russell appeared in front of Small, its face inches away. The eyes were once again black orbs, and his breath smelled of sulfur as it laughed. Pulling Beverly Newman's bra out from under his jacket, he tossed it into the box. The image of George Russell flew back and watched the article of clothing land on top of the soil from his grave. A mournful cry from the ghost filled the room. Small watched as the candle flames all leaned to the right as if a wind circled the container. Pointing his infrared thermometer at the box, the temperature now read close to freezing. Without hesitation, he rose and quickly placed the lid securely on the box and took it to a workbench. A muffled scream could be heard from within. Placing an anvil on the lid, Small used a soldering iron to seal the box all the way around. Removing the anvil, He sprinkled salt on the lid and sealed the grains in place with clear packing tape. The screams from within the box grew louder. With the container sealed, Shorty Small put the box in his SUV and drove to the address given to him by Madame Adriana. The old nun who waited outside the tomb watched him approach. "Are you Shorty Small?" "Yes." She reached for the box, which he handed to her. Without another word, the woman entered the ancient concrete structure behind her. The last time he saw the box was when the sister placed it in a hole in the wall within the mausoleum. He watched her seal the space and say a few words he could not hear. She then made the sign of the cross and returned to his location outside. He handed her an envelope, and like Madame Adriana, she placed the package in a pocket of her cloak without opening it. He said, "Thank you." She nodded and closed the door to the crypt. Once this was done, she walked past him and entered the small church without exchanging any other words. Shorty Small slept soundly until noon when he woke with a start. Claire's side of the bed remained empty. Suddenly he remembered she would be back by mid-afternoon. As was his habit developed over the course of the past few weeks, he glanced at the wound on his left wrist. The scar was now barely visible. As he studied it, his cell phone chirped. "Hello?" "Shorty, it's Homer. We need to meet as soon as possible."
Chilling tales for dark nights.